I was fighting for my life on an operating table, while my daughter-in-law was supposed to be watching my 4-year-old twin grandchildren. She told the doctors she was taking them to my warm and safe house. Instead, she abandoned them in the freezing cold so she could throw a wild party using my money. She made one fatal mistake, though. She thought I was going to die on that table. When I finally woke up and found out what she did to my grandbabies, my blood turned to absolute ice, and I decided right then that she was going to lose everything. The rhythmic and agonizing beep of a heart monitor was the first thing that broke through the heavy darkness. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were bolted shut. My chest burned with a deep and visceral pain, like someone had split me open with a crowbar and poured hot coals inside my ribs. I am Frank Gibson. I am 68 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life rebuilding shattered diesel engines with my bare hands. I know what it feels like to be crushed under the weight of broken machinery. But nothing could ever prepare me for the suffocating terror of being trapped inside my own paralyzed body, unable to move or speak, while a nightmare unfolded right next to my bed. The anesthesia was still running thick through my veins, holding me hostage. I could not move a single muscle, but my hearing was slowly coming back to life. There were voices hovering just a few feet away from my face. They were hushed and urgent. "Are we absolutely certain the parents have not been reached yet?" That was a deep and authoritative voice. "A police officer. We have tried calling the mother 6 times, a woman replied. Her voice trembled slightly. "Probably a nurse." She listed herself as the primary contact when they brought him into the emergency room yesterday. "And the father?" the officer asked. "He works on an offshore oil rig down in the Gulf," the nurse explained. "We are trying to get an emergency line through to his superintendent now." Then came the sentence that made my heart slam against my ribs so violently the monitor beside me began to screech. How long were the children left in the freezing cold? The officer demanded, his tone dropping into something cold and furious. The paramedics estimated at least 5 hours. The nurse whispered, "It dropped to 30 degrees last night, officer. If that neighbor had not heard them crying from inside that detached garage, I do not think those 4-year-old twins would have survived until morning." Sam and Lily, my grandbabies, the absolute light of my life. A pulse-pounding righteous rage flooded my veins, fighting against the heavy sedatives. Kendra had them. My daughter-in-law had looked me dead in the eyes before they wheeled me into surgery and promised she would keep them safe. I screamed into the darkness of my own mind, fighting against the ventilator tube lodged in my throat. Every alarm in the room started blaring as my panic spiked. I needed to wake up. I needed to protect my family from the monster I had foolishly allowed into our lives. The darkness finally gave way to a blinding, sterile white light. I felt the rough hands of a nurse gripping my shoulder. A harsh voice told me to cough. The plastic tube was ripped from my throat. It felt like dragging barbed wire out of my lungs. I gagged and choked, gasping for the recycled hospital air. Every breath I took sent a shockwave of absolute agony through my chest. 40 years of busting my knuckles on heavy machinery. 40 years of blowing out my back under oil-dripping semi-trucks. And none of it came close to this pain. My breastbone had been sawed in half and cracked open like a rusted engine block. Searing heat radiated from the metal staples holding me together. But the physical torture was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological terror clawing at my brain. The words I had heard while I was paralyzed were echoing in my ears like a funeral bell. How long were the children left in the freezing cold? I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and useless. Only a pathetic broken croak came out. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the heavy chemical blur from my vision. The intensive care unit came into focus. It was a bleak and terrifying place filled with cold stainless steel and flashing monitors that documented every struggling beat of my damaged heart. I turned my head slowly, ignoring the sharp pull of intravenous tubes and wires taped to my skin. I looked to the left and then to the right. There was a cheap vinyl armchair sitting in the corner of the room. It was completely empty. My son Tommy was not there. My daughter-in-law Kendra was not there. There was no one waiting for me. just the cold hum of medical equipment and the smell of antiseptic. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, mingling with the tears I refused to shed. Tommy works on an oil rig out in the Gulf of Mexico. I knew it would take time for him to get a helicopter flight back to the mainland. But Kendra was supposed to be here. She had looked me right in the eyes before the anesthesia hit and swore she would keep my grandbabies safe. She promised she was taking Sam and Lily back to my large, comfortable house where it was warm and secure. Why was that chair empty? Why was a police officer talking about hypothermia earlier? The panic started to rise in my chest, choking me faster than the breathing tubes ever could. The heavy glass door to my room slid open with a soft thud. A man in green surgical scrubs walked in. He looked utterly exhausted. Dark circles hung heavy under his eyes, and his posture was weighed down by a grim fatigue. He stepped up to the edge of my bed and picked up the chart hanging at the foot of my mattress. He introduced himself as Dr. Harris, the cardiovascular surgeon who had operated on me. He did not smile. There was no celebratory relief in his voice. He spoke with a slow and measured tone that made my blood run cold all over again. He told me I had suffered a massive aortic aneurysm, a widowmaker tear he called it. He explained that the main artery pumping life into my body had ripped wide open without warning. He said it was an absolute miracle I had even made it to the operating table alive. He had spent 8 grueling hours putting my shredded heart back together. The odds of me waking up were less than 10%. I listened to his clinical explanation, but his words sounded like they were coming from underwater. I did not care about the aneurysm. I did not care about the metal staples holding my chest together or the fact that I had cheated death. I only cared about my family. I forced my dry, cracked lips apart. My voice sounded like crushed gravel when I finally managed to speak. "Where is my family?" I demanded with every ounce of strength I had left. "Where are my grandchildren?" Dr. Harris stopped talking mid-sentence. His hands froze on his plastic clipboard. He looked down at me, and I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than death ever could. It was pity. It was deep and agonizing pity. He shifted his weight nervously and refused to meet my intense gaze. He told me I needed to stay calm. He said my heart rate was elevating and my blood pressure was climbing to dangerous levels. He tried to tell me I needed to focus entirely on healing my broken body. I grabbed the cold metal rail of my hospital bed with my calloused hand. I gripped it so hard my knuckles turned stark white against my bruised skin. I asked him again, "Where is Kendra? Where are Sam and Lily?" The doctor swallowed hard. He told me the hospital social worker and a police detective would be in shortly to explain the situation. He said it was not his place to give me the details. Not his place. Those 3 words confirmed every single horrifying suspicion burning in my mind. If my family was safe and sound, they would be standing right here beside me. If Kendra had taken the twins home to my warm living room, she would be sitting in that vinyl chair complaining about the hospital coffee. But the chair was empty. The room was empty. My chest heaved with agonizing pain as I realized I was entirely alone. The woman I trusted to protect the most precious things in my world had abandoned me. She thought I was going to die on that operating table. She thought I would never wake up to ask where my grandchildren were. The physical agony radiating from my cracked sternum was completely overshadowed by a fierce and violent need to protect my blood. I was an old retired diesel mechanic, but my mind was sharpening into a deadly weapon. I laid there in that sterile room, staring at the empty chair and making a silent vow to God. Whoever let my grandbabies freeze was going to face a reckoning they could never comprehend. The heavy silence in my hospital room felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shattered chest. Every slow and agonizing beep of the heart monitor was a reminder that I was still trapped in this broken body. I stared at the blank white ceiling, trying to force my mind to stay sharp. The surgeon had left me alone with my terrifying thoughts. The medication was trying to pull me back into a deep and dreamless sleep, but I refused to close my eyes. I could not sleep while my grandbabies were out there somewhere. I am a man who spent 4 decades wrestling with heavy steel and breathing diesel fumes. I built my life on the belief that if you work hard and protect your own, you will be fine. Now everything I built was hanging by a very thin thread. The pain radiating from my sliced sternum was a constant searing fire, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the ice-cold dread settling in my gut. I waited and watched the heavy glass door. It felt like hours had passed when the door finally slid open again. Two people walked into my room, and neither of them wore hospital scrubs. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a rumpled gray suit. His face was weathered and his jaw was set tight. He carried a small black notebook in his hand. Right behind him was a younger woman carrying a thick clipboard. She wore a plain navy cardigan and had a look of deep professional sorrow etched into her features. I knew instantly who they were before they even spoke a single word. You do not live 68 years without learning how to spot a police detective and a social worker. My heart rate immediately spiked, and the monitor beside my bed began a rapid and frantic warning cry. The man stepped up to the side of my bed and held out a gold shield. He introduced himself as Detective Miller with the local police department. The woman stepped up beside him and quietly introduced herself as Sarah from Child Protective Services. Hearing that specific agency named out loud felt like a physical punch to my throat. Child Protective Services. Those are words no grandfather ever wants to hear associated with his family. The detective looked down at me with a mixture of pity and hard professional resolve. He asked me if I was Frank Gibson and if I was the legal grandfather of Samuel and Lily Gibson. I managed a weak and desperate nod. My mouth was too dry to form any words. The woman named Sarah clutched her clipboard tightly against her chest. She told me they needed to ask me some questions about my daughter-in-law, Kendra. I tried to force my raw vocal cords to work. I rasped out a demand asking them where my grandchildren were. The detective exchanged a heavy and dark look with the social worker. Detective Miller looked back down at me and took a slow breath. He told me that my 4-year-old twin grandchildren had been brought into the emergency room of this very hospital earlier this morning. My entire world completely stopped spinning. The sterile white walls of the intensive care unit seemed to close in around me. Sam and Lily were here in the hospital. I felt a surge of pure panic flood my veins. I demanded to know what happened to them. I demanded to know where Kendra was and why my innocent grandbabies were in the emergency room. The social worker stepped closer to my bed and her voice trembled slightly as she delivered the news. She told me that Kendra did not take the children back inside my warm, comfortable house like she promised. Instead, the twins were found abandoned on my property. They were not inside the house. They were found locked outside in the freezing cold. The detective took over the explanation, his voice turning hard and flat. He told me the temperature had dropped below freezing last night. A neighbor walking their dog early this morning heard faint crying coming from the edge of my property. The police were called to investigate. They found Sam and Lily huddled together, shivering and severely hypothermic. My blood ran absolutely cold. It turned to absolute ice in my veins. My sweet, innocent grandbabies had been left to freeze while I was on an operating table fighting for my life. The detective said they were treating the children downstairs for severe cold exposure. He said they were stabilizing, but it was a very close call. A close call. The words echoed in my skull. Kendra had left them to die. She had abandoned my flesh and blood in the freezing cold. A blind and primal fury exploded inside my chest. It was a violent, righteous indignation that completely overpowered the heavy sedatives pumping into my blood. I am a father and a grandfather before I am anything else in this world. I let out a raw and broken roar that tore my raw throat to shreds. I refused to lie in this bed while my family was suffering. I had to get to them. I had to see them with my own eyes and wrap my arms around them to make them warm again. I threw my right arm forward, grabbing the thick intravenous tube taped to my skin. I ripped it out with one violent jerk. Blood spattered across the crisp white hospital sheets. The monitors behind me began screaming in a continuous and deafening panic alarm. The detective yelled for me to stop and lunged forward to hold my shoulders down. The sudden movement felt like my cracked sternum was being ripped entirely in half. The agony was blinding, but I did not care. I thrashed against the mattress, kicking my legs and fighting the detective with every ounce of blue-collar strength I still possessed. I demanded to see my grandbabies. I roared for someone to bring me to my twins. The door burst open, and 3 nurses rushed into the room. They shouted orders at each other, grabbing my arms and pinning me down against the mattress. The physical pain in my chest was absolute torture, but the psychological terror was infinitely worse. I saw a nurse push a clear syringe into the main line connected to my other arm. The social worker was crying quietly in the corner of the room. The detective was holding me down, telling me to stay with him and calm down. I felt the heavy, freezing rush of the chemical sedative flooding into my bloodstream. My limbs started to go numb, and my vision began to blur into a dark tunnel. I fought the darkness with everything I had left. I fought the heavy weight pulling my eyes shut. I stared at the ceiling as my body finally went completely limp. I could no longer move, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. As the blackness finally pulled me under, I made a silent and unbreakable vow. Kendra had crossed a line she could never uncross. When I woke up from this dark sleep, she was going to face the wrath of a grandfather who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I would tear her world apart piece by piece. I need to take you back a few years to help you understand how much my family means to me and why I sacrificed everything for them. My name is Frank Gibson, and I am 68 years old. For 40 long, grueling years of my life, I was a heavy diesel mechanic. I did not wear a clean suit to work, and I did not sit in a comfortable air-conditioned office. I spent 4 decades crawling under 18-wheelers and massive earth-moving equipment. I breathed in toxic diesel exhaust and heavy fumes until my lungs burned. My hands are permanently stained with dark engine grease that no amount of industrial soap or hard scrubbing can ever wash away. Every single knuckle on my hands has been busted open, bleeding and scarred over more times than I can possibly count. My palms feel like heavy grit sandpaper. I gave my physical body to that freezing concrete floor. I blew out 3 discs in my lower back, trying to lift heavy transmissions and rushing to meet impossible freight deadlines. I tore my rotator cuffs, tearing down rusted engine blocks so that shipping trucks could get back out on the highway. I worked outside in the bone-chilling sleet and the blistering summer heat that baked the metal until it burned my skin. I took every single hour of overtime the shop foreman would give me. I worked the late-night shifts, the weekends, and the holidays. I missed a lot of football games and quiet Sunday mornings resting at home. But I never complained once about the pain or the exhaustion. I did it all for a very specific and beautiful reason. I did it for my wife Helen and the family we were building together. Helen was the absolute center of my universe and the only good thing in my rough life. She was a kind and gentle woman with a warm laugh that could make the darkest and longest day feel bright. When we first got married, we had absolutely nothing to our names. We lived in a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the baseboard heater barely worked and the roof leaked into pots and pans every time it rained. But Helen never once made me feel like a failure. She would wake up in the dark to pack my lunch every single morning before the sun came up. She would meet me at the door with a smile every evening when I came home exhausted and covered in dark grime. She stretched every single hard-earned dollar I made, making sure we always had a hot meal on the table and clean clothes on our backs. I made a silent, solemn promise to myself during those early, struggling years. I promised God that I would build a life for Helen, where she would never have to worry about a single bill again. I wanted to give her the entire world, so I saved aggressively. I invested every spare penny I managed to make. While other guys at the mechanic shop were buying fancy new trucks or going out for drinks after their shifts, I put my overtime pay straight into high-yield investment accounts and mutual funds. I studied financial books late at night when my back ached too much for me to sleep. Slowly and steadily over 40 years, that money grew. It compounded and multiplied until this blue-collar diesel mechanic had built a multi-million-dollar nest egg. I kept very quiet about it. I did not want to show off or act better than anyone else. I just wanted absolute security for my wife. 10 years ago, I finally bought Helen her dream home. It was a beautiful, sprawling 5-acre property out in the peaceful country. I built a massive wrap-around porch with my own hands so she could sit outside and drink her sweet tea in the morning sun. I tilled the hard soil and built her a massive flower garden where she grew the most beautiful, fragrant roses you have ever seen. I also built a large detached garage on the edge of the property where I planned to restore old classic trucks in my retirement. We had finally made it. We had fought through the bitter hard years, and we had reached the finish line hand in hand. But life is incredibly cruel and unfair sometimes. We only got 5 short years to enjoy that beautiful, sprawling property together before the sickness came. The doctors caught her illness way too late. It was a vicious and aggressive cancer that moved through her fragile body like a wild, spreading fire. I spent every dollar I could liquidating assets and trying to save her. I flew her to the best medical specialists in the country and paid out of pocket for the most advanced experimental treatments, but absolutely none of it worked. I had to watch the woman I loved more than my own life slowly fade away in a sterile and cold hospital bed. 5 years ago, Helen took her final breath while holding my calloused and scarred hand. When her pure heart stopped beating, I felt my own soul get ripped right out of my chest. Losing Helen completely and utterly destroyed me. The sprawling 5-acre property suddenly felt like a massive and empty tomb without her voice echoing in the halls. I would sit on that wrap-around porch staring out at her overgrown rose garden, and I would weep until my eyes were swollen, and I had absolutely no tears left to cry. The multi-million-dollar bank accounts meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. All the money in the entire world cannot buy back one single minute with the person you truly love. For months, I wandered around that big, empty house like a lost ghost. I stopped going into my workshop to fix things. I stopped caring about my health or what I ate. I honestly wanted to lay down in the dirt and die so I could be with her again. I was completely ready to give up on life. But I remembered the very last conversation I had with Helen before she passed away. She made me promise not to surrender to the grief. She squeezed my hand with the last of her strength and told me that our family still needed me here. She told me that our son Tommy was going to need a strong and steady father to guide him through life. She told me that I had to stick around to be a grandfather to the babies Tommy would have one day. She made me swear to God that I would pour all the love I still had for her directly into our future grandchildren. That sacred promise to my dying wife was the only thing that kept my heart beating and my lungs breathing. Our family became my entire world. Tommy and his twin babies, Sam and Lily, became my sole reason for waking up and getting out of bed every single morning. I decided right then and there that the financial empire I had built with my bare hands and broken back would be used to protect them at all costs. I wanted to make sure Tommy never had to struggle the way Helen and I did in the beginning. I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress of love and financial security around my bloodline. I transferred all my fierce protective instincts toward my son and the family he was starting. I truly thought I was creating a safe haven for the people I loved most. I thought my hard-earned wealth and my decades of physical sacrifices would permanently shield them from the cold and cruel realities of the modern world. I had absolutely no idea that the very financial security I built with my own blood and sweat was going to attract a greedy and heartless monster right to our front door. My boy Tommy is 34 years old now, and he is cut from the exact same stubborn cloth that I am. He works as a roughneck out in the Gulf of Mexico on a massive deep-water offshore oil rig. Let me tell you right now, that is absolutely not a job for the weak of heart. It is brutal and bone-crushing physical labor. Tommy works grueling 12-hour shifts surrounded by deafening heavy machinery and freezing saltwater spray. He is out there suspended over a dark and churning ocean for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, completely isolated from the rest of the world. Every time he flies out on that transport helicopter, my chest tightens with a deep paternal worry. But I also feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Tommy took that dangerous job because he wanted to be the ultimate provider. He wanted to make sure his family never had to scrape the bottom of the barrel the way his mother and I did when we were first starting out. He is a good, honest man who trades his physical comfort for a paycheck to give his children a beautiful life. Sometimes he calls me from the satellite phone on the rig and his voice sounds so utterly exhausted that it breaks my heart. He tells me about the freezing winds howling across the deck and the relentless mechanical roar of the drilling equipment. But then he asks about his children, and I can hear the warmth instantly flood back into his tired soul. He tells me to hug them tight for him and to remind them that Daddy is working hard so they can have everything they ever need. When Tommy is out there on that freezing metal platform, his entire heart and soul remained firmly anchored back here on dry land with his two beautiful children. My twin grandbabies, Samuel and Lily. They are 4 years old, and they are without a single doubt the absolute light of my remaining years. When my beautiful wife Helen passed away, I honestly thought the sun would never rise again. I thought my sprawling 5-acre property would just slowly rot away into a silent and dusty tomb. But those two precious babies pulled me right out of the suffocating darkness. They breathed life back into my shattered soul. Samuel is a fierce and energetic little boy with a crooked grin that looks exactly like Tommy when he was that age. He is always running, always climbing, and always trying to figure out how things work. Lily is a gentle and sweet little angel who inherited her grandmother Helen's bright and compassionate eyes. When she looks up at me and wraps her tiny little fingers around my rough, calloused thumb, it feels like God himself is reaching down to heal my broken heart. I wanted to give them a piece of magic right here on my property, something that would stand strong for decades and remind them of how much their grandfather loved them. So I went out to the massive ancient oak tree standing tall right on the edge of my back field, and I decided to build them a custom treehouse. I did not buy a cheap plastic kit from a hardware store. I drew up the architectural blueprints myself at the kitchen table. I drove down to the lumber yard and hand-picked the strongest treated pine I could find. I spent 3 solid weeks working from sunrise until the evening shadows stretched across the lawn. My blown-out back screamed in agonizing pain every time I climbed the ladder, and my arthritic knees throbbed with every heavy swing of the hammer. But I did not care about the physical toll. The pain felt incredibly good. It felt like a righteous and holy purpose. I sanded every single wooden plank down until it was smooth as glass so my grandbabies would never get a splinter. I built a sturdy wrap around deck, a heavy-duty rope bridge, and a bright red slide that spiraled all the way down to the soft grass below. I even installed safe clear windows and painted the entire structure a cheerful bright yellow, because Lily told me yellow was her favorite color. The afternoon I finally showed it to them is a memory etched permanently into my soul. Tommy had just gotten back from a brutal 3-week rotation on the oil rig. He stood next to me on the porch, and we watched Sam and Lily run across the yard screaming with pure, unrestrained joy. They scrambled up the wooden steps, and their high-pitched laughter echoed through the branches of that old oak tree. Tommy put his heavy arm around my shoulder and thanked me with tears shining in his tired eyes. In that beautiful golden moment, everything in the universe felt perfectly right. Every single time Tommy deployed back to the dark waters of the Gulf, I made it my personal mission to be the sturdy rock those kids needed. I would sit out on my back porch with a steaming mug of black coffee, just watching them play in the safety of my backyard. I cherished every single second I got to spend with them. We would catch fireflies in empty glass jars as the sun went down. I taught Sam how to hold a tape measure, and I let him help me tighten the small screws on his toy wagons. I let Lily plant tiny sunflower seeds in the soft dirt of Helen's old garden, and we watered them together every single afternoon. I wanted them to know the value of building things with their own hands and nurturing life from the ground up. I would read them bedtime stories until their heavy eyelids fluttered shut and their breathing grew soft and steady. When you love tiny, innocent creatures that much, it completely changes you. It strips away all your tough, protective armor and leaves your heart entirely exposed. You realize that you would gladly walk through a roaring fire or step in front of a speeding train just to keep them from shedding a single tear. Tommy was out there breaking his back in the freezing rain and dangerous ocean gales to provide a flawless life for his children. I was back home dedicating every waking ounce of my retirement to keeping them safe and making them smile. We were 2 generations of proud blue-collar men pouring our absolute souls and our physical bodies into the solid foundation of this family. We trusted that our hard work was building a fortress of love around Sam and Lily. I would have given my last drop of blood for those twins without a single moment of hesitation. They were my legacy and my salvation. I loved them so deeply and so fiercely that the mere thought of anyone ever hurting a single hair on their heads was enough to make my blood boil. We thought we had secured their happiness, but we were entirely blind to the dark and greedy threat that was already standing right inside our own home. I always believed that if you look hard enough at a person, you will eventually see their true character shining through. I should have looked much closer at the woman my son chose to marry. Kendra was 30 years old, and she was completely consumed by how the world perceived her. To her, everything was about the superficial image. She had to have the perfect hair, the flawless nails, and the absolute newest luxury car parked in the driveway. She looked at my calloused hands and my faded denim work shirts with a poorly hidden disgust. I could see her nose wrinkle whenever I came over to their house straight from my workshop, smelling of motor oil and sawdust. She treated me like a dusty old relic that she was forced to tolerate. What made her quiet resentment so incredibly bitter to swallow was the undeniable truth of how she afforded her lavish lifestyle. Kendra did not work a single day since she married my boy. She lived entirely on the grueling physical labor Tommy endured out on that freezing offshore oil rig. Every single designer handbag she flaunted and every expensive vacation she took was paid for by the sweat off my son's back. Even the sprawling, beautiful 4-bedroom house she paraded around in was heavily subsidized by me. When Tommy and Kendra were ready to buy a home, I quietly transferred a massive portion of my hard-earned savings to cover the down payment. I wanted my grandchildren to have a secure roof over their heads. I did not do it for her, but she gladly accepted the gift and then acted as if she had earned it all by herself. I would sit on their pristine white living room couch, afraid to stain the expensive fabric, while Kendra scrolled endlessly on her phone. She was always posting pictures of her carefully curated life, trying to impress people she did not even truly know. I would watch her complain about the landscaping or the color of the granite countertops, while Tommy was hundreds of miles away wrestling heavy iron pipes over a churning ocean. It made a righteous anger boil up deep inside my chest. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand she show some respect for the man breaking his body to give her that luxury. I wanted her to understand the sheer physical agony that went into every dollar she swiped on that platinum credit card. But I kept my mouth completely shut. I bit my tongue so hard I could taste the blood. I swallowed my blue-collar pride every single time she made a snide remark about my boots tracking dirt or my truck leaking a tiny drop of oil on her immaculate driveway. I ignored the glaring red flags because I loved my son, and I worshipped my twin grandbabies. I convinced myself that keeping the peace was the absolute most important duty a grandfather had. I thought if I just smiled and stayed out of her way, Tommy would be happy, and the children would grow up in a calm home. The most baffling part about Kendra was the family she came from. She grew up in a strong and deeply respectable Black American household that valued hard work and absolute integrity. It honestly defied all logic how she turned out so vain and hollow when you looked at her older brother. Derek was 36 years old, and he was an absolute force of nature. He was a former United States Marine who had served his country with honor before putting himself through law school. Now he worked as a fierce and dedicated civil rights attorney right here in the city. Derek was a man built of solid iron and deep convictions. We connected instantly the very first time we met. He recognized the value of a hard day's work, and he respected the calluses on my hands. He knew what it meant to sacrifice your own comfort for the people you love and protect. Derek's wife Jada was just as remarkable. She was a warm and highly intelligent woman who always treated me with profound kindness and genuine respect. When we all gathered together for holiday dinners or summer barbecues, Derek and Jada would sit out on the porch with me for hours. We would share stories about building a good life and defending the innocent. Derek would ask me questions about fixing old diesel engines, and I would ask him about his complex legal cases in the courtroom. There was a mutual and unbreakable respect between us. They saw the deep love I had for my family, and they honored the quiet sacrifices I made over the years. Derek was not blind to his sister's flaws either. Sometimes I would catch him looking at Kendra with a heavy mixture of disappointment and deep frustration. He tried to guide her and remind her of the solid values their parents raised them with, but Kendra would just roll her eyes and dismiss him entirely. She thought his dedication to justice and honest hard work was somehow beneath her newfound wealthy status. While Derek tried to pull his sister toward the light, their younger sister Simone did the exact opposite. Simone was 28 years old, and she was Kendra's dark shadow and toxic enabler. If Kendra was a dangerous spark of vanity, Simone was the heavy gasoline thrown right on the fire. Simone was constantly over at the house, drinking expensive wine that Tommy paid for, and encouraging Kendra's absolute worst habits. The two of them would sit at the kitchen island, whispering and laughing like cruel high school girls. They would plan lavish weekend trips and exclusive shopping sprees using credit cards linked directly to my son's offshore paychecks. They treated his dangerous labor like a bottomless cash machine designed only to fund their empty desires. I would often catch Simone feeding Kendra's resentment toward me and my hardworking son. I overheard her once telling Kendra that Tommy was never around anyway, so Kendra deserved to live it up and enjoy her youth without guilt. Simone told her she should not have to be tied down by crying toddlers or an old dirty father-in-law who was always hovering around the property ruining their fun. I heard those deeply cruel words echo from the kitchen while I was out back fixing the children a wooden swing. It felt like a jagged knife twisting straight into my gut. I knew right then that Simone was a dangerous and toxic influence, feeding a dark greed inside Kendra's empty heart. She validated every selfish thought Kendra ever had and pushed her to demand more and more. But again, I pushed the pain down deep into my stomach, and I walked away silently. I was so incredibly foolish to think I could manage their toxic behavior by simply ignoring it. I told myself that young women just liked to gossip and spend money. I convinced myself that when the twins got a little older, Kendra would finally mature and realize the incredible blessing she had in a husband like Tommy. I gave her the benefit of the doubt over and over again because I desperately wanted to protect the fragile illusion of a happy family. I did not want my son to come home from a brutal 3-week shift on a dangerous oil rig, only to walk into a house filled with suffocating tension and bitter arguments. I chose absolute silence to shield him from the agonizing reality of his own toxic marriage. I took the emotional beating so he would not have to. Every time Kendra rolled her eyes at my stories, or Simone made a passive-aggressive joke about my old battered truck, I just focused my entire attention on Sam and Lily. I would scoop my precious grandbabies up into my arms and let their innocent, beautiful laughter drown out the toxic whispers of the two women plotting in the kitchen. I thought my deep love for those children was a strong enough shield to protect us all from the creeping darkness infecting that house. I thought my quiet patience was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of my family tree. I had no idea that my deafening silence was actually giving Kendra the perfect undisturbed cover to plan the most heartless and devastating betrayal a family could ever endure. I ignored the massive red flags waving right in front of my face, and I would end up paying for that terrible mistake with my own blood and the unbearable suffering of the innocent babies I swore to God I would always protect. Let me take you back to the exact moment my entire life shattered into a million jagged pieces. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just 24 hours before I woke up in that cold intensive care unit. The sun was shining down on my 5-acre property, casting long, beautiful golden shadows across the thick green grass. I was out in the backyard with my twin grandbabies, Samuel and Lily. Tommy was hundreds of miles away out on his oil rig, and Kendra was inside the house, likely scrolling on her expensive phone or taking pictures of her designer clothes. But out there under the shade of that massive ancient oak tree, it was just me and my two precious angels. We were playing a game of tag around the heavy wooden base of the custom treehouse I built for them. Sam was giggling so hard his little cheeks were flushed bright red, and Lily was clutching my thick, calloused hand, pulling me toward the bright yellow slide. I remember feeling a profound sense of peace. I remember looking down at their innocent, smiling faces and thanking God for giving me such a beautiful reason to keep breathing after losing my sweet wife, Helen. I was 68 years old, but in that golden moment, I felt as strong and invincible as a young man. And then, without a single warning sign, the absolute worst physical agony I have ever experienced in my entire life ripped straight through the center of my chest. It did not feel like a normal muscle cramp or a heavy ache. It felt like a violent and catastrophic explosion deep inside my ribcage. Imagine a thick, heavy steel cable snapping under 10,000 pounds of immense pressure and whipping straight through your internal organs. That is exactly what it felt like when my main aortic artery suddenly tore wide open. The pain was so blinding and so absolute that it instantly knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. I dropped to my knees on the soft grass, gasping for air that simply would not come. The bright blue sky above me instantly dialed down into a terrifying and suffocating shade of dark gray. A thick, cold sweat immediately drenched my entire body from head to toe. I could hear a horrific rushing sound roaring in my ears like a runaway freight train. Through the terrifying haze of my failing vision, I saw little Lily freeze in her tracks. Her bright, happy smile instantly melted into a look of pure confusion and mounting terror. "Grandpa," she asked, her tiny voice trembling with fear. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" I wanted to tell her I was fine. I desperately wanted to force a reassuring smile and tell her it was just a silly game. But my jaw was locked tight in absolute agony, and my vision was rapidly tunneling into total darkness. I collapsed forward, hitting the hard dirt with a heavy and sickening thud. My heavy, calloused hands clawed at the grass, trying to find some kind of leverage to pull myself back up. I could not die right here in the dirt, right in front of these precious, innocent babies. I could hear Sam starting to cry, a high-pitched and panicked wail that tore my broken heart to absolute shreds. Kendra finally came running out of the back door of the house, screaming something I could not understand. I felt her grab my shoulder and roll me over onto my back. Her face was hovering above mine, twisted in panic, but I could not focus on her. I was entirely focused on the sound of my grandbabies crying just a few feet away. I tried to reach my heavy, trembling hand out toward them to shield them from this absolute nightmare, but my arm felt like it was made of solid lead. Sirens began to wail in the far distance, cutting through the quiet country air. Kendra had called emergency services. The minutes that followed were a chaotic and violent blur of flashing red and blue lights, loud shouting, and the heavy boots of paramedics pounding across my front lawn. They descended on me like a swarm of urgent soldiers, ripping my faded denim shirt open and shouting medical codes over the deafening roar of my failing heartbeat. They strapped an oxygen mask over my face and hoisted my heavy body onto a rigid metal stretcher. As they rushed me toward the waiting ambulance, the world around me began to violently spin and fade. The piercing shriek of the ambulance siren rattled my bones as they slammed the heavy metal doors shut, sealing me inside the cramped and flashing box. The paramedic hovering over my chest was shouting urgent instructions to the driver, telling him to step on the gas because I was bleeding out internally. The vehicle lurched forward, tires squealing against the asphalt as we rocketed toward the hospital. Every swerve and bump in the road sent a fresh wave of blinding, white-hot agony tearing through my ripped aorta. But the physical torture was absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating psychological terror consuming my fading mind. I was not afraid of dying. I had made my peace with God a long time ago when Helen passed away. What terrified me to my absolute core was the thought of leaving Samuel and Lily behind. As the bright, harsh lights of the ambulance ceiling began to flicker and dim into a suffocating darkness, my last conscious thought was of my twin grandbabies standing alone and terrified in that sprawling backyard. Tommy was stuck out in the middle of the unforgiving ocean, and I was leaving his babies in the hands of a woman I deeply distrusted. I fought the heavy, crushing weight of the blood loss with every single ounce of blue-collar grit I possessed. I prayed with a desperate and violent intensity, begging the universe to keep my heart beating just a little bit longer. I could not abandon them. I could not leave them unprotected. The agonizing scream of the sirens slowly faded into a dull, distant hum, and the blinding pain in my chest was finally swallowed by a deep and terrifying blackness. The blinding fluorescent lights of the emergency room cut through the heavy fog in my brain like a jagged knife. I was laying flat on a rigid hospital gurney surrounded by a swarm of frantic medical staff shouting codes and commands. They were rapidly cutting away my faded denim work shirt and attaching cold, sticky monitor pads to my violently heaving chest. The pain was an absolute roaring fire spreading through my ribs, but my eyes darted frantically around the chaotic room, searching for the only thing that truly mattered. Samuel and Lily. A kind nurse had pulled them into a small, quiet alcove just outside my trauma bay to shield them from the gruesome sight of my failing body. I could see their tiny, tear-streaked faces pressed against the heavy glass window. They were clutching each other, looking so incredibly small and completely terrified in that sterile and frightening environment. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces watching them tremble. I tried to lift my heavy, grease-stained arm to wave at them to show them their grandfather was still strong and still fighting, but my muscles simply refused to obey. I was trapped inside a broken machine, and the only desperate thought consuming my panicked mind was, who is going to protect my precious grandbabies while I am bleeding out on this table? That is exactly when Kendra finally burst through the swinging double doors of the emergency department. If you did not know her true toxic character, you would have thought she was the most devoted and heartbroken daughter-in-law on the face of the entire earth. She put on an absolute masterclass of a performance for the doctors and the trauma nurses. She was wearing an expensive designer coat and carrying a pristine, luxury handbag that looked completely absurd against the bloody and chaotic backdrop of the emergency room. She rushed to the side of my gurney with fake tears streaming perfectly down her face. She gasped loudly and dramatically covered her mouth, asking the lead trauma surgeon if her beloved father-in-law was going to survive. She played the role of the terrified and vulnerable family matriarch with such flawless and sickening precision that even the hardened medical staff paused to offer her their deepest and most sincere sympathies. She thanked them profusely, wiping her dry eyes and begging them to do absolutely everything in their physical power to save my life. It was a disgustingly sweet display of fake devotion, but in my desperate and dying state, I was just profoundly relieved that someone from the family had finally arrived to take charge of the frightened children. The lead cardiovascular surgeon leaned over my face and explained that they needed to rush me into the operating theater immediately. He said every single passing second counted, and that my torn aorta was a ticking time bomb ready to burst completely. The heavy dose of intravenous painkillers was pulling me back down into a dark and suffocating undertow, but I fought the chemical weight with every single ounce of stubborn, blue-collar grit I still possessed. I needed to know that Samuel and Lily were going to be protected before I let the dark anesthesia take me away. I turned my heavy head slowly toward Kendra. My breathing was shallow and ragged, and I could barely force the raspy words past my dry, cracked lips. I looked up at her perfectly manicured face and pleaded with her to take care of the twins. I begged her to take them far away from the terrifying sights and sounds of this hospital and keep them completely safe until my son Tommy could get an emergency flight back from the offshore oil rig. Kendra leaned down very close to my face, making sure the surrounding nurses could hear her soothing and gentle tone. She reached out and placed her soft, perfectly lotioned hand over my rough and calloused fingers. She looked me dead in the eyes and swore a solemn and unbreakable vow. She told me not to worry about a single thing. She promised me that she was going to pack the twins up right now and drive them straight back to my sprawling 5-acre property. She said my house was much larger and far more comfortable than her place, and that the kids would feel completely secure surrounded by all their favorite toys and the custom treehouse I built for them. She promised she would tuck them into the warm guest beds, turn on the heavy-duty furnace to keep the autumn chill away, and stay right by their side, waiting for the phone call to hear that my surgery was a complete success. She spoke with such deep and convincing reassurance that for a brief and fleeting moment, I actually believed her. I believed that underneath all her shallow vanity and her toxic greed, she still possessed the basic maternal instinct to shelter her own children. A profound and heavy relief finally washed over my shattered chest. I thought about my sturdy house standing tall and strong out in the quiet country. I pictured the thick, heavy blankets on the beds and the pantry fully stocked with all the sweet treats I always kept ready for my grandbabies. I imagined Samuel and Lily curled up safely on the soft living room couch, watching their favorite animated cartoons while the doctors worked to repair my broken heart. That comforting and peaceful image was the only thing that allowed my tense muscles to finally relax and surrender to the heavy chemical sleep pulling at my brain. I gave Kendra a weak and desperate nod, silently transferring the weight of my entire world and my whole heart into her hands. I trusted her to do the one simple fundamental job any decent human being would do in a crisis. I trusted her to shelter the innocent. The nurses unlocked the wheels of my gurney and began pushing me rapidly down the bright white hospital corridor toward the cold surgical wing. I watched Kendra turn around and walk toward the glass alcove where Samuel and Lily were waiting. She held out her hands to them, playing the role of the comforting mother to absolute perfection. As the heavy steel doors of the operating room swung open and the anesthesiologist placed a dark rubber mask over my face, I let out one final sigh of relief. I thought I had secured their absolute safety. I thought I was leaving them in the hands of a fierce protector. I had absolutely no idea that the woman holding my precious grandbaby's hands was already calculating how quickly she could discard them into the freezing cold just so she could go celebrate my impending death. I went to sleep believing a beautiful and comforting lie, and I would wake up to the most cold and agonizing betrayal a grandfather could ever possibly endure. The heavy steel doors of the operating theater swung open, and a blast of freezing, sterile air hit my bare skin. They wheeled my hospital gurney into the center of the room beneath a massive bank of blinding surgical lights that looked like the chrome headlights of a runaway freight train. A team of masked doctors and nurses moved around me with a frantic and terrifying speed. I could hear the metallic clatter of surgical tools being laid out on stainless steel trays. A nurse with kind and gentle eyes leaned over my face and placed a dark rubber mask securely over my nose and mouth. She told me to take deep and steady breaths and to count backward from 10. I closed my heavy eyes and focused every single ounce of my fading willpower on the image of Samuel and Lily. I pictured my precious twin grandbabies sitting safely on the warm plush couch in my living room, holding their favorite thick blankets. I imagined Kendra handing them warm cups of hot chocolate, just like she promised me she would do. That comforting and beautiful illusion was the very last thing holding my shattered heart together as the thick and heavy chemical sleep finally dragged my mind down into an absolute black abyss. 10, 9, 8. And then there was nothing but a cold and suffocating darkness. I did not know it at the time as my chest was being sawed open and my blood was being pumped through a cold plastic bypass machine. But a completely different kind of nightmare was unfolding just outside those operating room doors. They had to literally stop my heart and lower my body temperature to keep my brain from dying while they stitched a synthetic graft into my torn aorta. I was hovering on the absolute razor edge between life and death. I was as vulnerable as a human being can possibly be. I only learned the horrifying and chilling details of this betrayal much later when the hospital surgical coordinator came into my intensive care unit room to speak with me. What she told me made the physical agony of my cracked sternum feel like a tiny paper cut compared to the psychological terror of what my daughter-in-law had actually done. The surgical coordinator was an older woman who had worked in that hospital for 30 years. She stood beside my bed with her hands trembling slightly as she held a thick manila folder. She told me that just minutes before the surgeon made the very first incision to save my life, Kendra had cornered the medical staff in the crowded surgical waiting area. My daughter-in-law did not approach them with tears in her eyes or a trembling voice begging them to save her father-in-law. Instead, she walked up to the central desk with an absolute and chilling calmness. She pulled a pristine sheet of paper out of her expensive designer handbag and slapped it down right in front of the surgical team. It was a formal legal medical directive. To be incredibly specific, it was a do not resuscitate order. I laid in my hospital bed staring at the coordinator as she explained the sheer and calculating evil of what Kendra had attempted to pull off. Kendra told the hospital staff that I had recently signed this binding legal document because I was an old, stubborn, blue-collar mechanic who never wanted to be kept alive on artificial life support machines. She looked the surgical coordinator dead in the eyes and lied with such a flawless and sociopathic conviction that it nearly worked. She claimed that my son Tommy, who was thousands of miles away, trapped on a freezing offshore oil rig in the middle of the dark ocean, had explicitly agreed to this directive. She told the doctors that if my heart stopped beating on that operating table, they were legally obligated to simply step back and let me pass away. She wanted them to let me bleed out. She wanted the monitors to flatline and for the medical staff to do absolutely nothing to bring me back. She wanted me to die right there on that cold steel table. The coordinator told me Kendra had the absolute audacity to stand there sipping a fancy iced coffee while she argued legalities. Kendra spun a massive and detailed web of lies, claiming that I had sat her down just weeks prior and explicitly expressed my desire to never be kept alive by machines. She told the staff that my late wife Helen had suffered in a hospital and that I refused to go out the same way. She weaponized the tragic and sacred memory of my beloved dead wife just to make her forged documents seem more authentic and believable. It makes me physically sick to my stomach knowing she used Helen's name to try and secure my murder. The coordinator told me she felt a deep and unsettling instinct that something was horribly wrong with the paperwork. The signature on the bottom of that formal document was supposed to be mine, but it looked rushed and sloppy. I am a man who spent 40 years turning wrenches and gripping heavy iron tools. My signature is thick and heavy and deliberate. The ink on that page looked like it had been hastily scribbled by someone with a light and trembling hand. The hospital staff immediately tried to contact my son Tommy to verify this sudden and dramatic medical directive, but they could not reach his satellite phone out on the drilling rig. Kendra stood right there in the waiting room, tapping her manicured fingers against her leather purse, demanding that they honor the forged paperwork immediately. She was rushing them. She was pushing them to accept a fraudulent death warrant for her own father-in-law, while the surgeon was actively fighting to repair my shredded aorta. Thank God the surgical coordinator trusted her seasoned instincts. She told me she refused to file the forged document into my official medical chart until she could get verbal confirmation directly from my son. She ordered the cardiovascular surgeon to proceed with all life-saving measures despite Kendra's loud and aggressive protests in the waiting lobby. Kendra had actually threatened to sue the hospital for violating my supposed medical wishes. She raised her voice and created a massive disruptive scene demanding that they stop the surgery and let nature take its course. She was practically salivating at the thought of planning my funeral. The sheer and unadulterated evil required to stand in a brightly lit hospital corridor and fight for the death of a man who gave you everything is something my traditional and hard-working mind could barely comprehend. When I heard this vile and gut-wrenching truth, the blood in my veins turned to absolute frozen ice. My breathing became so ragged and shallow that the heart monitor beside my bed began to frantically beep in warning. I closed my eyes and gripped the thin hospital bed sheets with my calloused and scarred hands. Kendra did not just abandon my innocent 4-year-old twin grandchildren in the freezing cold so she could go throw a party. She actively and intentionally tried to murder me. She calculated the odds of my survival and decided she needed to guarantee my absolute demise. She wanted me buried 6 feet under the cold, hard dirt, so she could gain immediate and unrestricted access to the multi-million-dollar financial empire I had sacrificed my entire physical body to build. I thought about the countless times I had welcomed that wicked woman into my sprawling home. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had quietly transferred to her bank accounts to make sure she never had to struggle or worry about putting food on the table for my grandchildren. I thought about how I bit my tongue and swallowed my heavy blue-collar pride every single time she mocked my dirty work boots or my grease-stained hands. I had tolerated her endless vanity and her sickening greed because I believed that keeping the peace was the right thing to do for my son Tommy. I had compromised my own dignity to keep our family together. And how did she repay that profound and silent sacrifice? She forged my signature on a death warrant and handed it to a surgeon while my chest was ripped wide open. She smiled in the faces of the medical staff and confidently asked them to let me die. Laying in that intensive care unit with tubes running in and out of my battered body, I realized that the woman my son had married was not just spoiled or selfish. She was a cold-blooded and calculating predator. She was a monster hiding behind expensive designer clothes and a fake dazzling smile. She thought she was so much smarter than the dirty old diesel mechanic who paid for her luxury lifestyle. She thought my sudden catastrophic heart failure was the perfect and incredibly convenient opportunity to wipe me off the face of the earth and inherit the massive 5-acre estate I had built for my late wife, Helen. She wanted my property, she wanted my hard-earned retirement accounts, and she wanted me permanently silenced before I could ever expose the dark and twisted rot festering inside her empty soul. The physical agony radiating from my surgical incisions was completely eclipsed by a fierce and overwhelming wave of righteous paternal fury. A deep and primal fire ignited inside my belly. I am a man who has survived crushed bones and brutal winters and the devastating loss of my beloved wife. I did not survive a widowmaker heart attack just to be discarded like a piece of dead and useless wood by a greedy and sociopathic daughter-in-law. She wanted me to flatline. She wanted the monitors to go silent. But I was breathing. My damaged heart was still stubbornly beating inside my chest, and with every single breath I drew, I made a solemn and unbreakable promise to God. I would use every ounce of strength I possessed to tear her fraudulent world completely apart. I was going to strip away every single luxury she thought she had secured. She forged my name on a death warrant, but she completely forgot one very important thing. You should never, ever try to bury a man who knows exactly how to handle a shovel. I slowly drifted back to consciousness. The heavy chemical sedatives they pumped into my veins were finally wearing off, but my mind still felt like it was buried under a thick layer of wet concrete. The sterile white ceiling of the intensive care unit slowly came back into focus. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed was steady now. It was no longer the frantic panic alarm from before. My chest throbbed with a dull and agonizing fire where the surgeon had sawed through my breastbone, but I pushed that physical pain completely aside. I turned my head toward the side of the room. Detective Miller was still sitting in the cheap vinyl chair next to my bed. He had not left. He was waiting for me to wake up. His weathered face looked even older now under the harsh fluorescent hospital lights, and he was holding that small black notebook tightly in his hands. I tried to speak, but my throat was incredibly dry. I managed a weak and raspy whisper, asking him to tell me everything. I needed to know exactly what happened to my grandbabies. Detective Miller leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked down at his notebook and took a very long and heavy breath. He told me that what he was about to read was the official police report filed by the responding officers early this morning. He warned me that it was going to be incredibly difficult to hear. I gripped the thin hospital bedsheets with my rough, calloused hands and braced myself for the absolute worst. I told him I needed the absolute truth no matter how much it hurt. The detective looked me right in the eyes and delivered the first devastating blow. Kendra did not leave the children alone inside my warm and secure house. She did not tuck them into the cozy guest beds with thick blankets like she had looked me in the eyes and promised to do while I was bleeding out on a hospital gurney. The police arrived at my 5-acre property because a neighbor called in a noise complaint mixed with reports of a child crying. When the patrol cars pulled up to my massive iron gates at 2 a.m, they did not find a quiet and peaceful home. They found a massive underground party raging inside the pristine walls of the house I had built for my late wife, Helen. Detective Miller read directly from the official incident report. He stated that there were over 40 people inside my home. Loud music was blasting so heavily that the windows were vibrating in their frames. Empty liquor bottles and crushed beer cans were scattered across the expensive hardwood floors I had installed with my own 2 hands. Kendra had essentially turned my sacred family sanctuary into a chaotic and filthy nightclub the very minute she believed I was going to die on the operating table. She was hosting a wild celebration while I was having my chest cracked open. But the agonizing betrayal of the party was absolutely nothing compared to what the officers found when they stepped outside into the freezing night air. The detective flipped a page in his notebook, and his voice grew thick with a deep professional anger. When the officers asked Kendra where her 4-year-old twins were, she was heavily intoxicated and dismissive. She waved her hand toward the back of the property and told the police she had to lock Samuel and Lily outside in the detached mechanic's workshop. Her exact words, recorded by the responding officers on their body cameras, were that she put them out there so they would not ruin the expensive carpets while she was entertaining her guests. I laid there in my hospital bed, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer and unadulterated evil of that statement. She locked my innocent grandbabies out in a filthy, unheated garage just to protect a rug. My chest heaved violently, causing a sharp spike of white-hot agony to radiate through my surgical staples. The detective continued reading the horrifying details. He told me that the temperature outside had plummeted to 30 degrees that night. A bitter and freezing frost had settled over the entire county. My detached workshop is a massive metal building designed for housing heavy diesel trucks and heavy-duty iron engine blocks. There is absolutely no insulation in those walls. The floor is made of thick poured concrete that turns into a slab of pure ice during the late autumn and winter months. It is an incredibly dangerous place for a small child, even in the middle of a warm summer day. It is filled with sharp metallic tools, heavy chains, toxic engine fluids, and jagged pieces of rusted scrap metal. When the police officers rushed across my dark backyard and forced open the heavy steel door of my workshop, they were met with a scene that will haunt me for the absolute rest of my natural life. The interior of the garage was pitch black and freezing cold. They shined their flashlights across the dark and oily concrete floor, searching desperately for the twins. They found them huddled together in the far back corner of the garage, shivering violently and completely terrified in the freezing darkness. Detective Miller paused and looked up at me. His eyes were red and shiny with unshed tears. He was a hardened police veteran, but this detail was breaking his heart just as much as it was breaking mine. He told me that Samuel and Lily only survived that freezing 30-degree night because of an old, heavy-duty sleeping bag. I keep a thick, industrial-grade winter sleeping bag tossed in the back cab of my old restoration truck just in case I ever break down on the side of a lonely highway in the dead of winter. Samuel, my brave and incredibly smart 4-year-old grandson, had managed to climb up into the dusty cab of that old truck. He dragged that heavy canvas sleeping bag down to the freezing concrete floor. He wrapped it tightly around himself and his little sister Lily to protect them from the biting wind howling through the metal gaps of the garage doors. The police report noted that when the officers found them, Samuel had his arms wrapped fiercely around his crying sister, trying to share whatever tiny amount of body heat he had left. Their little lips were completely blue, and their skin was icy to the touch. They were crying out for their father, and they were crying out for me. They had been trapped out there in the freezing blackness for over 5 hours, while their own mother was inside my warm and brightly lit house drinking expensive champagne and laughing with strangers. When the detective finished reading that paragraph, the silence in the intensive care unit became absolutely suffocating. I could not hold it back anymore. A deep and agonizing sob ripped its way up out of my raw throat. I did not care about being a tough blue-collar mechanic in that moment. I completely broke down. Hot, bitter tears flooded my eyes and streamed down my weathered cheeks, soaking into the sterile white hospital pillows. I wept with a profound and soul-crushing grief for the immense suffering my innocent grandbabies had endured. I pictured little Samuel acting like a brave protector in the freezing dark, doing everything he could to keep his sweet sister warm, because the adult who was supposed to love them had tossed them aside like garbage. I wept because I had failed them. I had allowed that toxic and heartless woman into our family, and my blindness had nearly cost my grandchildren their lives. The image of them huddled together on that oil-stained concrete floor, shivering and terrified, will be permanently burned into the back of my eyelids until the day God finally takes me from this earth. I cried until my lungs burned and my chest felt like it was going to split open all over again. Detective Miller put his notebook away and placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. He told me that the doctors said the kids were going to make a full physical recovery. He said they got to them just in time before the hypothermia caused any permanent internal organ damage. But I knew the psychological scars of being abandoned by their own mother in the freezing dark would take a lifetime to heal. As the hot tears finally stopped falling, a completely different emotion began to rise up from the very bottom of my soul. The agonizing grief slowly hardened and crystallized into something else. It turned into a pure, unadulterated, and righteous fury. It was a cold and calculating anger that completely eradicated the chemical fog in my brain and the physical pain in my chest. Kendra had brought the absolute devil into my home, She had risked the lives of my son's beautiful children just to throw a party and celebrate my impending death. She thought she was untouchable because Tommy was stuck on an oil rig and I was bleeding out on a surgical table. I laid my head back against the pillow and stared straight up at the sterile ceiling tiles. The sadness was completely gone now, replaced by an absolute iron resolve. My blood felt like it was boiling in my veins, yet my mind was as sharp and focused as a freshly honed carving chisel. I wiped the remaining tears from my rough face with the back of my hand. I looked at the detective, and my voice did not shake even a little bit when I spoke my next words. I told him I was going to need his help. I told him I was going to systematically dismantle every single piece of Kendra's comfortable and luxurious life. I was going to strip away her freedom, her stolen money, and her absolute unearned arrogance. She thought she could lock my flesh and blood in a freezing garage and get away with it. She completely forgot that she was dealing with a man who had spent 40 years building machines from broken parts and tearing down heavy steel with his bare hands. I survived the Widowmaker heart attack for one very specific and holy purpose. God kept me alive on that operating table so I could deliver the exact brand of blue-collar justice my family deserved. I was not going to just let the legal system handle her. I was going to wage a silent and meticulous war from this very hospital bed. The righteous indignation burning in my chest was hotter than any fever. I swore to the ghost of my late wife Helen that Kendra was going to pay for every single shiver and every single tear my grandchildren suffered on that concrete floor. The war had officially started, and she had absolutely no idea the storm that was coming for her. I laid in that sterile hospital bed listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor next to my head. The police detective and the social worker had left the room, leaving me completely alone with the crushing weight of their horrific report. My chest felt like it had been split open by a heavy iron wedge and set on fire, but the physical agony was absolutely nothing compared to the cold and violent rage pumping through my veins. Kendra had locked my 4-year-old twin grandchildren in an unheated concrete garage in the middle of a freezing night. She had abandoned the absolute most precious things in my entire world just so she could throw a wild party in my home. The sheer and unadulterated evil of her actions made my vision blur with a terrifying wrath. My first instinct was blind and primal. I wanted to rip the intravenous tubes out of my arms again. I wanted to force my broken body out of that hospital bed, steal a car, and drive straight to my 5-acre property. I wanted to kick down my own front door and drag that wicked woman out of my house by her expensive designer clothes. I wanted to stand over her and make her feel a fraction of the freezing terror that my innocent grandbabies had felt shivering on that oil-stained floor. But I am a man who spent 40 years rebuilding shattered diesel engines and diagnosing catastrophic mechanical failures. I know better than anyone that blind anger is completely useless when you are trying to fix a complex and deeply broken machine. If you swing a heavy hammer without looking at the blueprints, you will only cause more permanent damage. If I confronted Kendra right now, while I was trapped in an intensive care unit, she would just spin a massive web of manipulative lies. She would look the police officers in the eyes and tell them it was a terrible accident. She would cry fake tears and claim the children must have wandered outside on their own while she was busy cleaning the house. She would hire a slick defense attorney and twist the entire narrative to make herself look like an overwhelmed and grieving daughter-in-law who made a simple mistake. I could not allow that to happen. I could not let her escape the absolute maximum punishment for what she did to Samuel and Lily. I needed hard and irrefutable proof. I needed cold concrete evidence that would strip away every single lie she could ever possibly invent. I needed an inside man, because I was paralyzed in a hospital bed and my son Tommy was trapped thousands of miles away on a freezing offshore oil rig. I needed someone who possessed a fierce moral compass and someone who could walk right past Kendra's toxic defenses without raising her suspicions. There was only one man in this entire city who fit that exact description. I needed Kendra's older brother, Derek. I reached over with my heavy, calloused hand and pressed the red call button pinned to my bedsheet. A young nurse hurried into the room a few moments later, looking at me with a soft and sympathetic expression. I asked her to retrieve my personal belongings bag from the closet locker. My voice sounded like crushed gravel, but she understood my urgent tone. She brought me my cell phone and placed it gently in my trembling hand. I stared at the dark screen for a long moment, gathering my remaining strength. Calling a man to help you destroy his own sister is a heavy and terrible burden, but I knew Derek was a man built of solid iron and deep, unshakable convictions. Derek had served his country as a United States Marine. He had faced the absolute worst of humanity overseas, and he had returned home to become a fierce and dedicated civil rights attorney. He built his entire career on defending the innocent and holding the wicked completely accountable for their actions. Derek and his beautiful wife, Jada, had always treated me with profound respect. We had spent countless summer evenings sitting on my wrap-around porch drinking sweet tea and talking about the value of honest hard work. Derek was not blind to Kendra's immense vanity or her toxic greed. He had spent his entire adult life trying to guide her toward the light, and she had spent her entire life rolling her eyes at his noble efforts. I knew deep down in my soul that Derek valued truth and justice far more than he valued a blind and toxic loyalty to a sister who had clearly lost her mind. I dialed his number and held the phone to my ear. He answered on the second ring. His deep and booming voice echoed through the small speaker, asking me how I was doing. He told me he had just heard about my massive widowmaker heart attack and was planning to come to the hospital after he finished a court hearing. I did not waste a single second on polite small talk. I told him to drop absolutely everything he was doing and get to the intensive care unit immediately. I told him it was a matter of life and death involving Samuel and Lily. The tone of my voice must have conveyed the sheer and terrifying gravity of the situation because Derek did not ask a single question. He simply told me he was on his way and hung up the phone. The agonizing wait for Derek to arrive felt like an absolute eternity. I stared at the blank white ceiling tiles, trying to control my breathing so the heart monitor would not trigger another panic alarm. I thought about the heavy, thick concrete floor of my detached mechanics workshop. I built that massive garage 10 years ago to restore classic vintage trucks in my retirement. It was a cavernous space filled with sharp metallic tools, heavy chains, and thousands of dollars worth of specialized professional equipment. Because my sprawling 5-acre property was located out in the quiet country, I had always worried about thieves breaking into the shop while I was asleep or away running errands. A few years ago, a string of burglaries hit our rural county. Criminals were breaking into barns and stealing expensive power tools to sell at pawn shops. To protect my hard-earned investments, I hired a professional security company to install a state-of-the-art hidden camera system. I had 4 high-definition wireless security cameras discreetly mounted inside the dark corners of the workshop. They were hidden behind heavy wooden beams and tucked away inside old dusty ventilation grates. I also had 3 hidden cameras installed inside the main house to monitor the front and back entryways. The entire system ran on an invisible and encrypted wireless network that uploaded high-resolution video and crystal-clear audio directly to a secure cloud server. Kendra had absolutely no idea those cameras existed. She was far too obsessed with her designer clothes and her social media image to ever step foot inside my dirty, oil-stained garage. She thought she was committing her heinous crimes in total darkness. She was incredibly stupid. She had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy her comfortable and luxurious life. The heavy glass door to my hospital room finally slid open with a soft thud. Derek walked in wearing a sharp, navy blue tailored suit. His broad shoulders completely filled the doorway and his face was etched with deep concern. He stepped up to the side of my bed and looked down at me with a profound sadness in his eyes. He told me I looked like I had gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight champion. I managed a weak and bitter smile. I told him the surgery was a walk in the park compared to what I was about to tell him. I asked him to pull the vinyl chair close to the bed and close the door tightly behind him. Derek sat down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, giving me his absolute and undivided attention. I took a slow and painful breath, and I told him everything. I told him about the police detective and the social worker visiting my room. I told him about the massive underground party Kendra had thrown inside my pristine home while I was bleeding out on the operating table. And then I told him the most devastating truth of all. I told him how the responding police officers found my 4-year-old twin grandchildren locked outside in the freezing 30-degree night. I described how Samuel had dragged my heavy canvas sleeping bag out of an old truck cab to wrap around his shivering little sister. I watched Derek's face as I spoke the agonizing words. I watched the concern in his eyes melt into pure, unadulterated shock and then harden into a violent and righteous fury. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. The color drained completely out of his face and his large hands curled into tight, shaking fists. He was a man of the law, but in that specific moment, he looked like a protective uncle ready to tear a monster completely apart. Derek closed his eyes and took a deep, trembling breath, trying to control the massive wave of absolute disgust washing over his soul. He looked back at me and his voice was a low and dangerous rumble. He asked me what I needed him to do. He told me he would pull every single legal lever he had to make sure Kendra never saw the light of day again. I felt a profound wave of gratitude for this honorable man. I told him we could not just rely on the police report because Kendra would try to spin a million comfortable lies. I told him we needed the raw and undeniable truth recorded in high definition. I reached out my trembling hand and gripped his forearm. I looked him dead in the eyes and I told him about the hidden security cameras mounted inside my mechanic's workshop and throughout the main hallways of my house. I told him that every single thing Kendra did last night was captured on digital video and uploaded to a secure server that she knew absolutely nothing about. Derek's eyes widened with a sudden and sharp realization. He understood exactly what I was handing him. I was giving him the ultimate weapon to dismantle his own sister's life. I asked Derek to pull out his cellular phone and download the secure security application from the internet. I walked him through the complicated setup process step by step. I gave him my private administrative username, and I dictated the complex master passcode that unlocked the entire encrypted network. Derek typed the information into his phone with rapid and precise movements. He tapped the final button to log into the main server. The application loaded, and a grid of dark video feeds suddenly appeared on his bright digital screen. I laid back against my sterile hospital pillows and let out a long and heavy sigh. The keys to the kingdom had been officially handed over. I told Derek to rewind the digital footage to the exact hours of the freezing night. I told him we were going to sit in this cold and quiet hospital room and watch exactly what kind of monster had infiltrated my family tree. We were going to gather the ironclad evidence we needed to wage a silent and meticulous war, and we were going to make absolutely certain that Kendra lost everything she had ever valued in this world. Derek walked back into my intensive care unit room, holding a large silver tablet tightly in his hands. The heavy glass door sealed shut behind him, blocking out the quiet hum of the hospital hallway and leaving us alone in the sterile silence. His face was carved from solid stone, and his jaw was locked so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He pulled the uncomfortable vinyl chair right up to the edge of my bed and set the tablet flat on the mattress over my knees. I adjusted my broken body, trying my hardest to ignore the white-hot agony shooting through my cracked sternum. I needed a clear and unobstructed view of the screen. I needed to see exactly what kind of monster had infiltrated my family tree. Derek tapped the glass screen and the security application loaded. The connection secured itself to the hidden wireless network back at my 5-acre property. I took a deep and ragged breath. The air tasted like harsh chemical antiseptic. My heavy, calloused hands gripped the thin white hospital blanket as we pulled up the main living room camera feed and synchronized the digital timestamp to the exact hours I was bleeding out on the operating table. The digital video feed flickered for a brief second and then sharpened into crystal clear high definition. I stared at the screen and my blood instantly turned to frozen ice inside my veins. My beautiful and pristine home was completely unrecognizable. The sprawling living room that my late wife Helen had decorated with such care and the floors I had built and maintained with my own 2 hands were packed shoulder to shoulder with dozens of strangers. They were stomping their muddy shoes all over the expensive hardwood floors I had spent weeks polishing on my hands and knees. Empty beer bottles and spilled dark liquor stained the expensive plush rugs. The hidden microphone mounted inside the air conditioning vent picked up the deafening bass of loud thumping club music. It was absolute and utter chaos. It looked like a wild riot happening right inside my sacred family sanctuary. But the true horror was not the property damage or the disrespect to my home. The true and suffocating horror was knowing that while these strangers were laughing and spilling alcohol in my warm, brightly lit living room, my precious 4-year-old twin grandchildren were huddled together, shivering in the pitch-black, freezing cold of my unheated mechanics workshop just a few yards away. The sheer cruelty of it made my chest heave with a violent and righteous fury. I could feel the monitors beside my bed start to beep faster, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I could not look away from the screen. Derek tapped the glass to switch the view to the massive, open-concept kitchen camera. That is when we finally spotted them. Kendra and her toxic sister Simone were standing right in the center of my granite kitchen island. Kendra was wearing a skin-tight, expensive designer dress that my hard-working son Tommy had undoubtedly paid for with the sweat off his back. She did not look like a grieving daughter-in-law whose family patriarch was fighting for his life. She looked radiant, glowing, and utterly thrilled. Simone was standing right next to her, pouring expensive champagne into tall, crystal flutes that had belonged to my late wife. Simone handed a full glass to Kendra, and they clinked them together with wide and greedy smiles on their faces. Derek let out a low and disgusted growl from the back of his throat as he watched his own sisters behave like heartless vultures circling a dying man. He leaned closer to the screen, tapping a button to isolate and amplify the audio feed from the kitchen camera. The heavy background music faded slightly, and their high-pitched toxic voices came through the tablet speakers with sickening and devastating clarity. As we listened to their idle chatter, a tall man with slicked-back, dark hair walked right into the center of the camera frame. He was wearing an expensive fitted suit and a heavy gold watch that gleamed brightly under the kitchen pendant lights. He walked straight up to Kendra, and without a single moment of hesitation, he wrapped his arm intimately around her waist. He pulled her body flush against his and kissed her deeply right there on the mouth in the middle of my kitchen. My heart slammed violently against my bruised ribs. This was not a friendly embrace or a casual greeting. This was a man who knew her intimately and thoroughly. This was a secret lover. My boy Tommy was out there in the freezing rain of the Gulf of Mexico, breaking his back on a dangerous and slippery offshore oil rig to provide a beautiful life for this wicked woman. He was working grueling 12-hour shifts covered in corrosive salt water and heavy industrial grease, just so she could sleep in a warm and comfortable bed. And here she was parading her secret lover through our family home while her own children were locked outside to freeze in the bitter cold. The level of sheer betrayal was so deep and so profoundly evil that it made me physically nauseous. I looked over at Derek. His large hands were clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles were stark white against his dark skin. He looked like he was completely ready to punch straight through the tablet screen and strangle the man himself. The tall man finally pulled away from the kiss and whispered something low into Kendra's ear. Kendra threw her head back and laughed a loud and careless sound that echoed through the hidden microphone like a sharp knife. She took a long, slow sip of her champagne and leaned back against the granite countertop. The man asked her casually how the surgery was going. We heard Kendra's voice ring out crisp and absolutely devoid of a single ounce of human empathy or compassion. She smiled brightly and proudly announced to the group standing around her that the doctors told her I had less than a 10% chance of surviving the night. She raised her crystal flute high into the air and loudly declared to the kitchen that this was not just a regular gathering of friends. She smiled, her perfect white teeth gleaming on the camera feed, and called it a death watch party. She told her lover and her sister that they were celebrating because the stubborn old diesel mechanic was finally going to kick the bucket and leave them all in peace. Simone cheered loudly and raised her glass in enthusiastic agreement. Kendra then began to openly and shamelessly brag about the massive inheritance she was about to secure. She laughed and said that once I flatlined on the operating table, she and Tommy would instantly inherit the sprawling 5-acre estate, the multi-million-dollar retirement accounts, and every single financial asset I had spent 40 brutal years building with my bare hands. She looked deeply into her lover's eyes and promised him that they were going to take all that money and travel the entire world together in absolute luxury. She spoke about my impending death like she had just won a massive state lottery jackpot. There was not a single shred of grief or concern for my life or for the immense and crushing pain my son Tommy would feel losing his only remaining parent. She was just eagerly waiting for the final tragic phone call from the hospital so she could start spending the money I had bled my entire life to save. I lay there in my sterile hospital bed, absolutely paralyzed by the pure venom I had just witnessed. The physical pain of my cracked sternum was completely and utterly erased by a towering inferno of blue-collar wrath. I had sacrificed my entire physical body, my spine, my knees, and my calloused hands to give my family an impenetrable fortress of financial security. And this heartless monster was literally dancing on my grave before I was even put in the cold ground. Derek reached out with a trembling finger and pressed the power button on the tablet, turning the screen completely black. He could not stomach watching another single second of his sister's vile and disgusting behavior. He slowly stood up from the vinyl chair and paced across the small hospital room like a caged animal. The silence between us was heavy dark and completely suffocating. When Derek finally turned back to look at me, his eyes were completely cold and utterly empty of any familial mercy. He walked back to my bedside and placed his large, strong hand gently over my trembling arm. His voice was a deep and dangerous rumble that promised absolute and unrelenting destruction. He looked me dead in the eyes and he apologized. He sincerely apologized that his own flesh and blood had brought this level of absolute evil into my quiet home. He told me that Kendra was no longer his sister. She was a predator who had abandoned innocent babies to freeze and celebrated the death of a hard-working man just to satisfy her own shallow and pathetic greed. Derek swore a solemn and unbreakable vow right there in the intensive care unit. He promised me on his honor as a former Marine and a man of the law that he would use every single legal weapon at his disposal to help me tear her fraudulent life completely apart. We were going to pull her financial records and trace every stolen dime. We were going to expose her disgusting affair to my son Tommy. And we were going to make absolutely certain that she faced the absolute maximum criminal penalties for child endangerment and massive financial fraud. We were going to make her lose the sprawling house, the stolen money, the custody of the children, and eventually her freedom. I nodded slowly, feeling a cold and calculated focus settle over my entire mind. Kendra threw a massive party to watch me die, but she completely failed to realize one very crucial detail. I did not die on that operating table. I woke up, and the angry ghost she thought she was celebrating was about to become her absolute worst nightmare. I lay completely still in that sterile hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic hum of the machinery keeping me alive. Derek and I had just finished watching the security footage that shattered my entire world. My chest was a cavern of physical agony, but my mind was operating with a cold and terrifying clarity. We knew Kendra was coming. The hospital staff had notified her earlier that morning that I survived the initial surgery. We knew she would be walking through those intensive care unit doors any minute now, not to comfort me, but to confirm whether or not she was finally rich. I looked over at Derek and Detective Miller, who had just returned to the room. I told them I needed to buy some time. If Kendra knew I was awake and aware of what she did to my grandbabies, she would immediately start covering her tracks, destroying financial documents and emptying the remaining bank accounts. I told the detective I needed to play dead. Detective Miller understood the assignment immediately. He stepped out into the hallway and spoke quietly with the charge nurse. They agreed to run interference for me. When the heavy door to my room finally clicked open, my eyes were already sealed shut. I forced my breathing to become incredibly shallow and steady, matching the rhythm of the mechanical ventilator that was no longer hooked up to my throat. I completely relaxed every single muscle in my battered body, turning myself into a heavy and motionless slab of meat. I could hear the sharp and rhythmic clicking of Kendra's expensive designer heels echoing against the linoleum floor. She walked right up to the edge of my bed. I could smell the strong and overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume mingling with the harsh medical antiseptics. It took every single ounce of my blue-collar willpower not to reach up, grab her by the throat, and demand to know how she could lock my innocent grandchildren out in the freezing cold. but I stayed completely paralyzed. I was a diesel mechanic, and I knew exactly how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The charge nurse walked into the room holding a clipboard and speaking in a hushed and somber tone. I listened closely as she delivered the exact script we had prepared. She looked at Kendra and told her that I had suffered a catastrophic complication during the night. She explained that the lack of oxygen during the Widowmaker tear had caused severe and irreversible damage to my brain. The nurse lowered her voice and delivered the final devastating blow to my fake diagnosis. She told my daughter-in-law that Frank Gibson was currently in a persistent vegetative state. She said there was absolutely zero brain activity and that I would never wake up again. I laid there trapped in the darkness behind my closed eyelids, waiting for her reaction. Kendra did not gasp. She did not sob. She did not reach out to hold my calloused hand. Instead, I heard a sharp intake of breath that sounded exactly like pure and unadulterated relief. When she finally spoke, her voice was an absolute masterclass in fake grief. She asked the nurse what the next steps were for someone in my specific condition. She did not ask if there was any hope for recovery. She immediately pivoted to the logistics of my permanent incapacitation. She asked if the hospital required any legal paperwork from the family regarding my estate and my financial obligations. The sheer and calculating greed in her tone was enough to make my blood boil hot enough to melt solid iron. She was standing over a man she thought was essentially a corpse, and all she cared about was getting her hands on the multi-million-dollar nest egg I had spent 40 years breaking my back to build. The nurse politely told Kendra that the hospital social worker would be in touch to discuss long-term care facilities and legal next steps. I heard Kendra's heels click against the floor as she turned around and walked right out of the room. She did not say a single word of goodbye to me. The heavy glass door slid shut behind her, and the room fell back into a heavy silence. I waited exactly 2 full minutes before I finally opened my eyes. Derek was standing in the corner of the room with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it was carved out of solid granite. He had watched his own sister pretend to mourn while secretly celebrating my permanent brain damage. The disgust radiating off him was palpable. I looked at Derek and told him we officially had our window of opportunity. Kendra firmly believed I was a vegetable. She thought Tommy was unreachable out on his offshore oil rig. She assumed she had absolute and unrestricted access to my property and my finances. She was going to get sloppy, and she was going to make massive mistakes. But I needed someone to block her from executing any legal maneuvers while I was trapped in this hospital bed. I looked Derek dead in the eyes and asked him to be my shield. I told him I needed him to become my official legal proxy. Derek did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. As a seasoned civil rights attorney, he knew exactly what documents we needed to draft and sign to give him absolute power of attorney over my medical and financial decisions. He pulled a thick legal pad out of his briefcase and sat down right next to my bed. He told me that as of this exact moment, my hospital room was no longer an intensive care unit. It was a silent and highly classified war room. We were going to track every single move Kendra made. We were going to monitor her bank transfers, her phone calls, and her attempts to sell off my assets. Derek swore to me that he would stand between his toxic sister and my hard-earned legacy like a wall of solid steel. We sat in that sterile room plotting the absolute destruction of a woman who thought she had already won the war. She thought she had buried me, but she was about to learn that you should never turn your back on a man who knows exactly how to tear a life apart piece by piece. Derek sat in the corner of my hospital room with his laptop open on a small rolling tray table. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across his face as his fingers flew across the keyboard. As an attorney, he knew exactly how to navigate the complex legal systems and bypass the heavy bureaucratic red tape that usually slows these things down. He had my newly signed proxy documents submitted to the bank fraud departments within a matter of minutes. We were no longer just sitting around hoping for the best. We were actively digging into the digital dirt to see exactly how deep his sister's betrayal really went. I watched the reflection of the computer screen shining in his dark eyes. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching tighter and tighter with every click. I asked him what he was seeing. My voice was still rough from the breathing tube, but the cold anger burning in my chest gave it a hard edge. Derek did not answer me right away. He just shook his head slowly and picked up his cellular phone to make another call. I listened to him speak to a senior branch manager at my primary financial institution. He cited legal statutes and demanded an immediate freeze on all pending property transfers and outbound wire movements. When he finally hung up the phone, he closed his eyes and let out a deep breath. He pulled his chair right up to the edge of my bed and turned the laptop screen so I could see the devastating truth. He told me to brace myself because Kendra had not wasted a single second. While I was laying on that operating table with my chest sawed open, she was actively executing a coordinated financial attack. Derek pulled up the ledger for my primary retirement savings account. This was the liquid cash I had saved up over 40 years of busting my knuckles on heavy diesel engine blocks. It was $400,000 of pure blood, sweat, and tears. I had kept that money easily accessible, just in case Tommy ever needed an emergency bailout, or if my twin grandbabies ever needed medical care. I stared at the screen and felt the air get completely sucked out of my lungs. The current available balance was zero. Kendra had completely drained the entire account. Derek explained that she had walked into a local branch yesterday afternoon while I was still under heavy anesthesia. She presented the bank manager with a forged power of attorney document. It was the exact same type of fraudulent paperwork she had tried to use to secure my do not resuscitate order. She had somehow managed to copy my signature well enough to fool a tired bank teller. She initiated a massive wire transfer, moving every single penny of my $400,000 life savings into a private offshore account registered solely under her own name. She wiped out 4 decades of my backbreaking physical labor in less than 10 minutes. The sheer evil of her actions made my vision blur with a terrifying rage. But Derek was not finished. He tapped a few keys and pulled up Tommy's joint checking accounts. My boy was currently out in the Gulf of Mexico, freezing in the saltwater spray and working brutal 12-hour shifts on an oil rig just to provide for his family. Derek showed me that Kendra had been systematically siphoning Tommy's heavy paychecks into hidden personal spending accounts for over a year. She was bleeding her own husband completely dry to fund her luxurious shopping sprees and expensive designer clothes. She treated his dangerous and grueling labor like it was nothing but a bottomless cash machine. Then Derek pulled up the final and most devastating document of all. It was a digital copy of a legal filing from the County Property Records Office. Kendra had initiated a quiet title transfer on my sprawling 5-acre estate. The very same house I had built and paid for with my own 2 hands. The beautiful home where my late wife Helen had planted her magnificent rose garden. The sacred family sanctuary where I had built a custom yellow treehouse for my precious grandchildren. Kendra was attempting to legally transfer the entire property deed directly into her own name. She had attached a fraudulent medical affidavit claiming I was permanently incapacitated and that she needed full ownership to manage my ongoing medical debts. She wanted to sell off my property, take the equity, and run away with her secret lover. She had locked my innocent grandchildren in a freezing and unheated garage to get them out of the way while she hosted a death watch party to celebrate stealing everything I owned. I laid in my hospital bed and stared at the digital proof of her absolute wickedness. The physical pain radiating from my surgical incisions was entirely overshadowed by a towering inferno of blue-collar wrath. I looked at Derek and saw the profound shame and disgust written all over his face. He was deeply horrified that his own flesh and blood could be capable of such monstrous and calculating greed. I reached out and placed my scarred hand over his arm. I told him not to carry her guilt because she was a monster operating entirely on her own. I told him she thought she had executed the perfect crime, but she had made one fatal mistake. She left a massive paper trail, and she failed to realize that I had a brilliant civil rights attorney sitting right by my side. I told Derek to gather every single piece of evidence. We were going to build an ironclad trap and crush her. Derek navigated the corporate channels to get my son off that offshore drilling rig. It was not a simple process to pull a man off a floating fortress of iron and steel in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Derek used his credentials as a civil rights attorney to bypass the endless chain of supervisors and contact the regional director. He declared an absolute family emergency, stating my condition was critical and Tommy needed to be airlifted to the mainland immediately. He kept the details intentionally vague so Kendra would not be tipped off by human resources. For 2 agonizing days, I laid in that hospital bed waiting for my boy to come home. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left in my battered body. I refused to let my son face this devastating betrayal without his father standing firmly by his side. It was late evening when the heavy glass door to my intensive care room swung open. Tommy stepped over the threshold, and the sheer sight of him broke my heart. He was 34 years old, but in that moment, he looked like a terrified little boy. He was still wearing his heavy canvas work jacket and his steel-toed boots. His face was covered in dark engine grease and dried saltwater spray. He had flown on a transport helicopter and taken connecting flights without stopping to sleep. His eyes were red and his broad shoulders were slumped under the crushing weight of expecting to find a dead man. Kendra had ignored his frantic messages, leaving him completely in the dark. He walked into that room prepared to plan his father's funeral. When Tommy looked up and saw me sitting against the hospital pillows, his entire body froze. The breath hitched violently in his throat. He dropped his heavy canvas duffel bag onto the linoleum floor and rushed to the side of my bed. He threw his thick, muscular arms around my shoulders and buried his face against my neck. I felt hot tears soaking into my thin hospital gown. I wrapped my scarred hands around his back and held my boy as tightly as my cracked sternum would allow. We stayed like that for a long time, just 2 blue-collar men holding on to each other in the face of a terrifying storm. He pulled back and looked at me with a profound relief shining in his tired eyes. He asked what happened and why Kendra was not answering her phone. He asked where Samuel and Lily were. I took a deep, ragged breath. I looked over at Derek standing silently in the corner holding the silver computer tablet. I told my son to sit down in the vinyl chair. I told Tommy I needed him to be stronger than he had ever been in his entire life. I told him what he was about to see was going to rip his heart completely out of his chest, but he needed to witness the absolute truth. Derek stepped forward and placed the tablet directly into Tommy's rough hands. We did not start with the financial documents or the forged medical papers. We started with the darkest and most unforgiving truth of all. Derek pressed play on the security footage from the detached mechanic's workshop. Tommy stared at the bright screen as the pitch-black garage came into focus. He watched the police officers force open the heavy metal doors with their flashlights cutting through the freezing darkness. He watched the light fall on the far corner of the oily concrete floor where his precious 4-year-old twins were huddled together under my old canvas sleeping bag. Tommy let out a raw, guttural, and agonizing sound of pure physical pain ripped straight from the very bottom of his soul. He watched his brave little boy wrapping his freezing arms around his shivering little sister. Tommy pressed his grease-stained hand over his mouth and wept with a violent, consuming grief. His entire muscular frame shook as he watched the paramedics carry his freezing children out of that unheated tomb. I reached out and gripped his knee tightly, letting him feel the solid weight of my presence. I told him they were safe now and recovering downstairs, but the truth was not over yet. Derek tapped the screen and switched the video feed to the interior house cameras. Tommy's weeping slowly stopped as the camera showed the massive underground party raging inside our pristine family home. He watched his wife wearing expensive designer clothes and laughing while their babies were locked outside in the bitter cold. Then the tall man with the slicked back hair and heavy gold watch stepped into the frame. Tommy stopped breathing entirely as he watched the stranger wrap his arm intimately around Kendra's waist and kiss her deeply right in the middle of our kitchen. He listened to the crystal-clear audio as Kendra raised her champagne glass and joyfully announced to the crowd that she was hosting a death watch party. He heard his own wife celebrating my impending death and bragging about the multi-million-dollar inheritance she was about to steal. I watched a terrifying transformation wash over my son. The hot tears drying on his cheeks were instantly replaced by a dark, dangerous shadow. The heartbroken husband vanished completely, and in his place stood a fierce, violently protective father who had just witnessed a monster try to destroy his entire bloodline. Tommy's jaw locked with a frightening intensity, and his dark eyes turned to absolute frozen ice. He set the tablet down on the tray table with a slow, deliberate calmness that was far more terrifying than any loud explosion of anger. The profound betrayal did not break him. It forged him into solid steel. He looked at me, and then he looked at Derek. His voice was a low, deadly whisper when he finally spoke. He did not shed another tear. He simply asked us exactly what the plan was to burn her entire life straight to the ground. We had our army, and the cold, calculating rage inside my son was the final weapon we needed to spring the ultimate trap. The three of us sat in that sterile hospital room surrounding my bed like soldiers planning a massive and silent siege. My boy Tommy was pacing the linoleum floor with his heavy work boots, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. Derek sat in the vinyl chair with his laptop open, his fingers tapping against the keyboard with a lethal precision. Detective Miller stood by the closed door, acting as our shield against the outside world. We were no longer just a grandfather, a father, and an uncle dealing with a family tragedy. We were an execution squad preparing to dismantle a monster. Derek looked up from his glowing screen and laid out the legal strategy. He told us that if we simply canceled the bank transfers and stopped the property deeds right now, Kendra would just claim it was a massive misunderstanding. She would hire a slick defense lawyer and argue that she was simply trying to manage my estate while I was incapacitated. She would get away with a minor slap on the wrist, and she would be free to walk away with her secret lover. We could not let that happen. We needed to lock her inside a cold prison cell for a very long time. Derek pulled out his cellular phone and connected us on a secure line with the senior fraud investigator at my primary bank. The investigator had seen the forged power of attorney document and was ready to freeze the $400,000 Kendra had stolen from my retirement savings. But Derek told him to hold off. He explained that we needed to let the money clear the initial holding phase. We needed the bank to allow the funds to technically hit the offshore account she had set up in the Cayman Islands. By letting the digital currency cross international borders under a forged signature, we were allowing her to commit federal wire fraud. The bank investigator agreed to monitor the transaction with a microscopic lens. He promised to freeze the offshore account the exact second the funds settled, ensuring she could never actually withdraw a single penny, but making sure the federal crime was completely and officially cemented into her permanent record. Tommy listened to this plan and nodded his head slowly, his eyes dark and completely devoid of mercy. We were giving her enough rope to hang herself. Next, we had to deal with the quiet title transfer on my sprawling 5-acre property. This was the house I had built with my bare hands, the sacred ground where my late wife Helen had planted her beautiful rose gardens. Kendra had submitted a fraudulent medical affidavit to the county property records office claiming I was permanently brain dead and that she required full ownership of my multi-million-dollar estate. Derek contacted his colleagues at the county clerk's office and brought them in on our silent sting operation. He instructed them to process the paperwork just enough to officially register the fraudulent transfer into the legal system. The absolute second that forged document was stamped and filed by the county clerk, her crime escalated from a simple attempted theft to aggravated grand larceny and first-degree felony forgery. We were wrapping a massive chain of undeniable felony charges around her ankles and tying it to a heavy iron anvil. It took an incredible amount of blue-collar grit and raw willpower to sit back and watch this wicked woman dismantle the work of my entire life on paper. I looked over at Tommy and saw the profound agony mixed with absolute cold calculation in his exhausted face. He was watching the woman he had loved, the mother of his precious twin children, actively digging her own grave with a silver shovel. Tommy knew that the brutal 12-hour shifts he had worked out on that freezing saltwater rig had been completely exploited by a monster. He knew every drop of sweat he had given to provide for his family had been used to fund her greedy and superficial lifestyle. He did not shed a single tear. He just asked Derek to confirm that every single legal trap was flawless and unbreakable. Derek promised him that between the child endangerment charges for locking Samuel and Lily in the freezing garage, the attempted manslaughter for the forged, do not resuscitate order, and these massive financial felonies, Kendra was going to be buried under a mountain of prison time. She thought she was an untouchable genius moving chess pieces around a board while we were all asleep. But we could see her every single move, and we were quietly changing the locks on the doors of the prison cell she was sprinting toward. The agonizing wait over the next 48 hours tested every single ounce of patience I had accumulated over my 68 years on this earth. My chest continued to burn with a vicious and searing pain from my cracked sternum, but my mind remained absolutely razor sharp. Detective Miller kept a close watch on the police reports, ensuring that Child Protective Services had Samuel and Lily completely secured and safely hidden away from Kendra's toxic reach. The bank fraud team sent Derek a secure notification confirming that the $400,000 had officially landed in the offshore account and had been instantly frozen by federal authorities. The county clerk sent a digital copy of the processed property deed confirming the felony forgery was locked into the government database. The trap was now fully and beautifully set. The steel jaws were completely primed and waiting for her to take one final step. The absolute silence of our war room was a stark contrast to the loud and chaotic death watch party she had thrown in my house. We were three men united by a fierce and unbreakable bond of protective love. We just needed her to make her ultimate arrogant move. We knew she believed I was a silent vegetable rotting away in an intensive care unit, and we knew she thought Tommy was stranded on a freezing oil rig out in the dark ocean. We sat together in that quiet hospital room, listening to the steady beep of my heart monitor, entirely ready to rise from the ashes and bring the absolute wrath of God down upon her head. It had only been 4 days since my chest was sawed open, but Kendra was already moving like a vulture, rushing to pick the bones completely clean. Derek had his silver tablet set up on my hospital tray table, and Tommy was standing right over my shoulder. We were watching the live feed from the hidden security cameras mounted inside my sprawling 5-acre property. Kendra truly believed I was laying in this bed as a brain-dead vegetable hooked up to a breathing machine. She fully believed her husband Tommy was thousands of miles away, trapped on a freezing metal platform in the middle of the dark ocean. And because she thought she was completely untouchable, she decided to host a massive estate clearing sale right there on my front lawn. I watched in absolute disgust as strangers parked their muddy pickup trucks and cheap vans all over the manicured green grass I had spent years maintaining. Kendra had thrown open the heavy oak front doors and the large metal bays of my detached mechanics workshop. She was practically running a flea market out of my sacred family sanctuary. She had hired a local liquidation crew to drag my entire life out onto the driveway with absolute zero regard for the blood and sweat that paid for every single item. My chest throbbed with a searing hot agony, but I did not look away from that screen. I needed to witness every single ounce of her greed, so I would not feel a single drop of mercy when we finally dropped the hammer. The camera mounted in the main hallway showed the true depth of her black and empty soul. I watched two burly strangers carrying my late wife Helen's antique cherry wood vanity cabinet right out the front door. Helen had cherished that piece of furniture. She used to sit in front of that mirror every single morning, brushing her beautiful hair and humming soft country songs. Kendra was selling the sacred memories of a dead woman for a stack of dirty $20 bills. I saw a stranger hauling out boxes of Helen's vintage porcelain dishes and her hand-stitched winter quilts. Kendra was standing on the porch, holding a thick wad of cash and barking orders at the movers like a tyrannical dictator. She did not care about the sentimental value of a single item. She only cared about liquidating my estate as fast as humanly possible so she could fund her lavish getaway. Then Derek switched the video feed to the camera hidden high up in the rafters of my mechanics workshop. My heart pounded a heavy and furious rhythm against my surgical staples. The tall, slick-haired lover, the same man who had kissed her in my kitchen during that despicable death watch party, was currently standing in the middle of my garage. He was casually negotiating prices on my professional-grade pneumatic impact wrenches and my heavy-duty air compressors. These were the exact tools I had used to put food on the table for 4 decades. I had busted my knuckles open gripping those heavy steel wrenches, and this arrogant stranger wearing expensive designer shoes was selling them off for pennies on the dollar. Tommy gripped the metal railing of my hospital bed so tightly I thought the steel frame might actually snap in half under his hands. The sickening spectacle did not end there. Derek pulled up the feed from the large, open-concept kitchen. Kendra's younger sister Simone was sitting casually on the edge of the granite island, exactly where they had stood just a few nights ago. Simone was drinking a massive glass of my expensive red wine, taking bottles I had carefully saved for a special family occasion. She was laughing loudly, tossing her head back and scrolling through her cellular phone. The hidden microphone in the ventilation grate picked up her toxic and completely heartless voice echoing through the kitchen. She was bragging to someone on the phone about how her brilliant sister had successfully robbed the dumb old diesel mechanic blind. She actually called me a rotting vegetable. She laughed about how Tommy was out in the freezing rain, busting his back on a rig, while Kendra was packing a luxury suitcase for a permanent vacation to a tropical island. The lover walked into the kitchen, clutching a thick envelope stuffed with the cash they had just generated from selling my entire life. He wrapped his arm around Kendra's waist and kissed her deeply right in front of Simone. They celebrated their fraudulent victory, passing the heavy envelope back and forth. They spoke openly about their flights out of the country, believing that the quiet title transfer had given them total legal immunity. They thought the $400,000 was sitting safely in their offshore accounts, waiting for them to arrive. They had absolutely no idea that every single digital dime had been frozen solid by federal fraud investigators. They had no idea that the county property deed they forged was currently acting as a massive felony trap, waiting to snap shut around their ankles. I looked up at Tommy. My strong and hard-working son had tears of pure, absolute rage streaming down his weather-beaten face. He was watching his own wife, the woman he had sworn to protect and provide, for casually dismantle his childhood home and mock his endless sacrifices. He watched her lover handle the tools that his own father had used to build their life. The heartbreak in Tommy's eyes had completely burned away, leaving nothing behind but a terrifying and cold determination. We did not need to say a single word to each other. The silent agreement between a father and a son was forged in absolute iron right there in that sterile intensive care unit. I reached down and ripped the adhesive heart monitor pads right off my bruised and aching chest. The nurses had already cleared me to move to a standard recovery room, but I was not going to stick around to eat terrible hospital food while thieves ransacked my sanctuary. I looked at Derek and told him it was time to pack up the war room. I told Tommy to help me get dressed in my heavy denim work clothes. I did not care if my cracked sternum felt like it was going to split wide open. I did not care if I could barely stand on my own 2 feet without gripping the wall for support. The time for quietly gathering evidence from behind a hospital bed was officially over. We had given Kendra enough rope to hang herself twice over, and she had gladly tied the noose around her own neck. It was time for the ghost to walk right through his own front door. We pulled up to the edge of my 5-acre property in an unmarked rental car. My chest was screaming with a white-hot burning pain from the surgical staples holding my breastbone together. Every single breath I took felt like inhaling broken glass, but I did not care. I refused to sit in a hospital bed while a monster dismantled my family legacy. Tommy parked the car at the end of the long gravel driveway. He killed the engine, and we sat in silence for a brief second. I looked at my son. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles were jumping under his skin. His hands were gripping the steering wheel with a terrifying white-knuckle intensity. I nodded slowly at him. It was time. Derek slipped out of the back seat without making a single sound. As a former Marine, he knew exactly how to secure a perimeter. He moved through the tall oak trees, heading straight for the back patio doors to cut off any possible escape route. Tommy got out and walked around to my side of the car. He opened the door and offered me his strong, rough hand. I took it and pulled my heavy, battered body out of the passenger seat. I was wearing my old, faded denim work jacket over my hospital bandages. I looked incredibly pale and fragile, but my soul was forged from solid iron. I stood up perfectly straight, refusing to let the agonizing pain show on my face. We walked up the long driveway together side by side. 2 generations of hardworking men ready to reclaim our home. The front lawn was covered with strangers carrying my late wife Helen's antique furniture and my heavy diesel tools. When they saw me walking up the pathway, they completely froze. They dropped boxes on the grass and backed away with their eyes wide open. They recognized my face from the framed photographs sitting on the mantle they were currently trying to sell. I did not say a single word to them. I just kept walking with slow and deliberate steps. We reached the massive, heavy oak front doors. They were propped wide open to let the liquidation crew move freely. Loud pop music was blasting from the living room stereo, echoing down the main hallway. I stepped over the threshold and walked right into my own house. Tommy was following just one step behind me like a massive and silent shadow. I walked straight into the main living room. There were at least 20 people inside, drinking and laughing and holding cash. I reached over to the stereo system and ripped the heavy power cord straight out of the wall socket. The loud music died instantly. A heavy and suffocating silence crashed down over the entire house. People turned around to see who had ruined the party, and then the crowd parted right down the middle. Kendra was standing next to the granite kitchen island. She was wearing a bright red designer dress, holding a tall crystal glass filled with my expensive vintage champagne. Simone was standing right next to her, laughing at some cruel joke. Kendra turned her head toward the living room, with a look of profound annoyance on her face. She opened her mouth to yell at whoever killed the music, but the words completely died in her throat. Her eyes locked onto my face. She stared at me standing there in my worn denim jacket, looking like an angry ghost who had just climbed out of a freshly dug grave. The transformation on her face was the most beautiful and satisfying thing I have ever witnessed in my 68 years on this earth. The smug and arrogant smile completely vanished. The warm flush of alcohol and celebration drained out of her cheeks in a single terrifying instant, leaving her skin a sickening shade of chalky white. Her eyes bulged wide open with absolute, unadulterated horror. Her perfectly manicured fingers went completely limp. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right out of her hand. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The loud crash of breaking glass echoed through the dead silent room, but Kendra did not even blink. She just stared at me with her mouth hanging open, completely paralyzed by the impossible sight of a dead man walking into his own home. The visceral and deeply profound satisfaction that washed over my bruised heart in that moment was an absolute cure for every single ounce of physical pain I was suffering. I watched her entire fraudulent world crumble into dust right in front of my eyes. Then the tall, slick-haired lover stepped out from the hallway, holding a thick stack of cash he had just collected from selling my tools. He looked around the silent room completely confused. He saw Kendra shaking and staring at me. He puffed out his chest and took a step forward, trying to act like the dominant man of the house. He demanded to know who I was and what I was doing ruining their estate sale. He had absolutely no idea who was standing right behind me. Tommy stepped out from my shadow. My son took one heavy step forward and the entire atmosphere in the room turned to absolute ice. Kendra let out a high-pitched and terrified gasp when she saw her husband. She thought he was thousands of miles away, trapped on a freezing oil rig in the middle of the dark ocean. But here he was, standing in his heavy work boots, with dark engine grease still stained into the deep lines of his face. The lover looked at Tommy, and his arrogant posture instantly collapsed. He tried to take a quick step backward, but Tommy moved with a terrifying and explosive speed. My son closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. The lover raised his hands, trying to speak, but Tommy did not give him a single second to form a lie. Tommy grabbed the front of the man's expensive tailored shirt with his heavy calloused hands. He lifted the lover clean off his feet and slammed him violently backward against the drywall. The impact rattled the framed pictures hanging in the hallway. The lover dropped the stack of stolen cash, and it fluttered down to the hardwood floor like dead leaves. Tommy glared right into the man's terrified eyes and swept his leg out, forcing the lover down hard onto his knees and pinning him completely flat against the floorboards. The man whimpered in pain and begged for mercy, but Tommy just held him down with the raw and unforgiving strength of a deep-water roughneck. Simone tried to run toward the back patio doors to escape the absolute disaster unfolding in the kitchen, but the heavy glass door swung open before she could reach the handle. Derek stepped inside, blocking the exit completely. He pulled the heavy deadbolt shut and locked it with a loud and final click. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and looked at his two sisters with a cold and devastating disappointment. The trap was now fully sprung. Every single exit was sealed. I stood tall in the center of my home, looking down at the absolute wreckage of Kendra's pathetic and greedy life. The silence in the room was heavier than solid iron, and I savored every single second of her suffocating terror. The heavy silence in my living room was violently shattered by the sudden and piercing wail of police sirens. Bright flashing red and blue lights swept across the large front windows, cutting through the quiet country afternoon and painting the walls in chaotic colors. The crowd of greedy strangers who had flooded my property to buy my stolen life immediately panicked. They dropped my heavy diesel tools and my late wife Helen's antique dishes right there on the grass, scrambling toward their cheap pickup trucks. They scattered like cockroaches, scurrying away from the light because they knew exactly what was coming. The massive oak front doors swung open even wider, and Detective Miller marched straight into the center of my home. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed uniformed officers whose hands rested firmly on their utility belts. They moved with a rigid and terrifying tactical precision, securing the room in a matter of seconds. Detective Miller scanned the terrified crowd, and his hard, experienced eyes locked instantly onto Kendra. She was standing frozen by the granite kitchen island, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of her perfect criminal plan. Her knees began to violently tremble, and she finally collapsed onto the expensive hardwood floor, her designer dress pooling around her. She tried to stammer out a pathetic and desperate excuse. She looked up at the detective with wide, panicked eyes and tried to tell him that there had been a massive misunderstanding. She stuttered that I was supposed to be in a hospital bed hooked up to a breathing machine, and that she was just organizing the estate for the good of the family. Detective Miller did not let her finish a single manipulative sentence. He stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, and pulled a thick pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp and metallic click of those cuffs snapping tightly around Kendra's wrists was the most beautiful and satisfying symphony I have ever heard in my 68 years on this earth. Detective Miller looked down at her with absolute and unadulterated disgust. He read her Miranda rights in a loud and booming voice that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, ensuring every single person in the house heard it. Then he began to list her crimes, letting each heavy felony drop onto her shoulders like a massive iron anvil. He told her she was officially under arrest for severe child endangerment for locking Samuel and Lily in the freezing 30-degree mechanics workshop. He announced the charges of first-degree felony wire fraud and grand larceny for forging my signature and draining $400,000 of my life savings. Kendra began to openly sob, shaking her head in wild denial, but the detective was not finished. He leaned in closer and delivered the absolute crushing blow. He arrested her for attempted manslaughter for handing a forged "do not resuscitate" order to my cardiovascular surgeon while I was bleeding out on the operating table. The sheer weight of that specific charge seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of her lungs. Across the kitchen, Simone tried to quietly slip out the back hallway, but she slammed chest first into a waiting uniformed officer. Detective Miller turned his cold gaze to her and ordered her cuffed immediately. Simone shrieked and fought, but she was quickly pinned and arrested as a willing accessory to felony fraud and child endangerment. The 2 toxic sisters who had laughed and drank my expensive champagne while celebrating my impending death were now sobbing and screaming on the floor like trapped animals. Their luxurious and arrogant world had completely evaporated into thin air. Tommy finally stood up from the floor where he had been pinning the slick-haired lover down. 2 police officers immediately stepped in and took custody of the coward, dragging him roughly to his feet by the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. The lover was crying and begging for leniency, swearing he had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing children or the forged medical documents. The officers ignored his pathetic whining and dragged him out the front door to a waiting patrol car. Tommy walked over and stood right beside me, a towering wall of silent and fiercely protective rage. But the absolute ruin of Kendra's life was still not finished. Derek stepped forward from the back patio door. He was dressed in his sharp, tailored navy suit, looking every bit the fierce and uncompromising civil rights attorney he was. He looked down at his own flesh and blood sister with a cold and devastating disappointment that cut deeper than any physical blow. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents. He tossed the heavy manila envelope right onto Kendra's lap. He told her in a calm and deadly voice that those were emergency divorce papers filed directly and aggressively on behalf of her husband Tommy. He did not stop there. He informed her that a county judge had already reviewed the police reports regarding the hypothermic twins and had signed a full and immediate revocation of all her parental custody rights. She was entirely stripped of any legal access to Samuel and Lily. Derek looked her dead in the eyes and told her she would never be allowed to see or speak to those precious children ever again. The uniformed officers grabbed Kendra by the arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, stained with the mascara and tears streaming down her panicked face. She thrashed against the steel handcuffs and wailed, begging Tommy for mercy and forgiveness. When my son silently turned his broad back on her, completely erasing her from his life, she turned her desperate and terrified eyes toward me. She cried out my name, begging me to tell the police to stop. She pleaded with me, claiming she was family and that we could fix this broken mess together. I stood up perfectly straight, pushing entirely past the agonizing pain radiating from my cracked sternum. I walked right up to her until we were mere inches apart. I looked into her sobbing and pathetic eyes with a gaze made of absolute solid ice. My voice was low and steady, rumbling from the very bottom of my chest. "You tried to bury me. You forgot I own the shovels." It has been exactly 6 months since that chaotic afternoon when the police dragged Kendra out of my living room in heavy steel handcuffs. The thick surgical staples in my chest have long been removed, leaving behind a thick, faded scar that I wear proudly, like a badge of absolute honor. The physical agony of my cracked sternum and torn aorta is completely gone. When I take a deep, slow breath of the fresh country air, my lungs feel stronger than they have in years. My broken body has healed, and my weary soul has finally found a profound and beautiful rest. The heavy wheels of the legal system turned with a swift and righteous fury. Kendra stood in front of a county judge and was handed a devastating 15-year sentence in a state penitentiary for severe child endangerment and massive felony wire fraud. There are no expensive designer clothes or luxury cars where she is going. She is locked inside a cold and barren concrete cell where she belongs. Her toxic sister Simone took a desperate plea deal to avoid a maximum prison sentence, but her life is completely ruined by a permanent felony record. The dark and greedy shadow they cast over my sacred family home has been entirely and permanently eradicated. My brave son Tommy never went back to that freezing and dangerous offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The agonizing thought of being thousands of miles away from his precious children was a heavy burden he refused to carry for another single second. He accepted a highly respected local management position at a heavy machinery plant right here in our town. He was granted absolute and full legal custody of Samuel and Lily. He gets to kiss their sweet foreheads every single morning before work and tuck them safely into their warm beds every single night. The dark and exhausted circles under his eyes have completely vanished, replaced by the bright and steady peace of a father who knows his bloodline is fiercely and permanently protected. I am currently sitting in my sturdy wooden rocking chair on the massive wrap-around porch I built for my late wife, Helen. Derek and his beautiful wife, Jada, are sitting right beside me drinking tall glasses of ice-cold sweet tea. They are the absolute truest definition of family, bound to us by a fierce and unbreakable honor instead of just blood. Out on the thick green grass of the sprawling backyard, Samuel and Lily are running wild and laughing at the absolute top of their lungs. They are racing toward the bright yellow custom treehouse bathed in the warm and golden afternoon sunlight. The terrifying memory of that freezing dark mechanics workshop has been entirely washed away by the boundless and overwhelming love surrounding them today. My damaged heart is completely full and my 5-acre sanctuary is finally at peace. I look back on that terrible night and I realize something very important about this world. People always talk about karma like it is some magical force that just falls out of the sky to punish the wicked. They think justice will just naturally find its way to the right people. But let me tell you the absolute truth. Karma does not just happen on its own. Sometimes karma requires a grandfather who is willing to rise straight up from his own deathbed to deliver it with his own 2 hands. I was bleeding and broken and my chest was torn completely open. But I refused to let an evil woman destroy the innocent lives I swore to protect. We are raised to believe that family is strictly defined by the blood running through our veins. We are told that we have to tolerate abuse and manipulation just to keep the peace at the dinner table. We are told to swallow our pride for the sake of the family name. But that is a dangerous and toxic lie. True family is not about blood at all. True family is entirely about who stands up to protect the innocent when the freezing winds start to howl. Derek and Jada showed me what real loyalty looks like. They chose absolute justice over a corrupt sister, and they helped me save my son and my precious twin grandchildren from a lifetime of misery. You have to be willing to take a heavy axe and chop down the rotten branches of your family tree so the healthy roots can finally grow and thrive in the bright sunlight. I spent 40 long years fixing broken diesel engines, and I learned a long time ago that you cannot just patch over a cracked foundation and expect the machine to run. You have to rip the damaged parts out completely and start over from scratch. That is exactly what I did with my life, and I have absolutely no regrets. If you are sitting out there right now dealing with a toxic relative or a greedy in-law who is trying to exploit your hard work, do not stay silent. Do not let them mistake your quiet blue-collar patience for weakness. Stand up tall and fight back with everything you have. You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to the innocent children who are relying on your strength. If you would do absolutely anything to protect your own grandchildren, I want you to hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Please let me know down in the comments exactly where you are watching from and what time it is right now in your specific city. Hearing from all of you out there truly warms my healed heart, and your incredible support is what keeps these important stories alive. Thank you for listening to an old mechanic tell his truth. Stay vigilant, protect your loved ones, and God bless you all.